They wanted him gone. Every silk-robed bastard in that council chamber wore the same calculated expression, polite concern masking naked ambition. Duke Cadric Dravenmore stood at the head of the table, hands clasped behind his back, watching them pretend they weren't plotting his destruction. 20 years he'd held the North through blood and calculated brutality, and now they circled like wolves who'd finally caught the scent of weakness. His father's voice echoed from childhood. Power is a blade held at your own throat. The moment you flinch, someone else grabs the handle. He wouldn't flinch. Not today. Not ever. Stick with me through this, because what's about to unfold isn't some fairy tale about redemption. It's a masterclass in survival when the world decides you've outlived your usefulness. The morning started with frost covering Ravenscar Keep's black marble walls like a death shroud. Cadric had been awake since before dawn, standing at his chamber window, watching the northern territories stretch beneath a sky the color of old bruises. Sleep had become a luxury he couldn't afford. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his father's face, not the powerful duke who'd ruled these lands with an iron fist, but the broken man he'd become in those final months. Weak, desperate, begging for mercy from nobles who'd smelled blood in the water. Cadric had been 17 when he'd watched them tear the old duke apart. Not with swords or poison, but with something far more vicious. Political maneuvering, whispered campaigns, manufactured scandals. They'd stripped away his father's authority piece by piece until all that remained was a hollowed-out shell wearing a title that no longer meant anything. The duke had died 6 months later, officially from a fever, unofficially from shame. That was the day Cadric learned the most important lesson of his life. Mercy was a luxury reserved for men who didn't understand how the game was actually played. A knock at the door pulled him from the memory. Sharp. Efficient. Exactly 3 raps. "Come in," he said without turning. Marcus entered, his boots barely making a sound on the stone floor. The captain of Ravenscar's guard was one of the few men Cadric actually trusted, mainly because Marcus had proven himself incapable of ambition beyond his station. Loyalty born from lack of imagination was still loyalty. "The council's assembled," Marcus said. "Lord Theron arrived an hour ago. He brought House Valdris's entire retinue." "Of course he did," Cadric replied. "Show of force. They want me to see how many swords he can put in my courtyard." Marcus hesitated. "Your Grace, there's something else. Lady Seraphine Vale arrived last night. She requested an audience." Cadric's jaw tightened. The disgraced noble's daughter. He'd heard the rumors. House Vale had fallen from grace spectacularly after her father had been caught embezzling from the crown's coffers. The family had lost everything except their name, and even that was tainted beyond repair. "What does she want?" "She wouldn't say. Only that it concerns House Vale's outstanding debts to the duchy." "Tell her I don't conduct charity work," Cadric said. "Whatever her father owes can be extracted from what's left of their estate." She anticipated that response. "She's offering herself as collateral." For the first time that morning, Cadric turned away from the window. "What?" Marcus's expression remained neutral. Her exact words were, "Tell the Duke that House Vale still possesses one asset of value, and I'm willing to negotiate terms." Cadric studied his captain's face for any sign of judgment and found none. "That's bold. Stupid, but bold. Shall I send her away?" "No." Cadric moved toward his desk, where maps of the northern territories lay spread across dark wood. "After the council meeting, I want to see what kind of woman walks into Ravenscar and offers herself as payment for her father's failures." Bus. The council chamber was exactly as Cadric expected, a performance staged for his benefit. 12 noble houses represented, each lord positioned according to carefully calculated hierarchies of power and influence. Lord Theron Valdris sat directly across from the Duke's chair, silver-haired and wearing the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. To his right, Lady Morgana Castell, sharp as broken glass and twice as dangerous. Lord Varon Ashcroft. Lady Isadora Greymarch. All the major players, all watching him with the same predatory patience. Cadric took his seat at the head of the table and said nothing. Let them make the first move. Let them show their hand. Lord Theron cleared his throat. "Your Grace, Thank you for convening this session. We have matters of urgent importance to discuss. Then discuss them, Kadric said. Theron's smile never wavered. It concerns the recent difficulties in managing the northern territories, the harvest failures, the increased banditry along the trade routes, the growing unrest among the peasantry. Difficulties that have been addressed, Kadric replied. The harvest failed because of drought, not mismanagement. The bandits have been hunted down and executed, and the peasantry is always restless. That's why we maintain order. Lady Morgana leaned forward. The concern, Your Grace, is whether the methods employed to maintain that order are sustainable. Kadric's gaze locked onto hers. Sustainable. Interesting word choice. What you mean is whether I'm being too harsh, too cruel, whether my approach is alienating the people we're meant to govern. I mean no disrespect, she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. But there are whispers throughout the realm. Stories of villages burned for failure to meet tax quotas, of public executions for minor infractions, of a duke who rules through fear rather than respect. Fear and respect are the same thing, Kadric said quietly. The only difference is which word makes you feel better about bowing. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. Lord Veron shifted uncomfortably. Lady Isidora's fingers tightened on her wine glass. Theron took a different approach. Your Grace, we're not questioning your authority. We're merely suggesting that perhaps a softer touch might yield better results. The people need to see strength, yes, but also compassion. Mercy. There it was, the word that made Kadric's blood run cold. My father showed mercy, he said. Do you remember what happened to him? Silence. He listened to men like you, Kadric continued, men who promised that kindness would win loyalty, that forgiveness would inspire devotion. And where did that mercy get him? Betrayed by his own council, stripped of his power, dead before his time. Your Grace, Theron began, but Kadric cut him off. I watched you all circle him like vultures. I was there when you manufactured scandals, when you undermined every decision he made, when you whispered poison in the ears of anyone who'd listen, and when he was finally weak enough, when he'd given away so much power in pursuit of your approval, you tore him apart. The Duke stood, his chair scraping against stone. So don't sit here and lecture me about mercy. Don't pretend this is about the peasantry or sustainability or any noble cause. You want me soft because soft rulers are easy to control. You want me merciful because merciful men hesitate. You want me weak because weak dukes don't last long enough to threaten your own ambitions. His voice was steady, controlled, far more dangerous than shouting. But I'm not my father. I don't need your approval. I don't need your friendship. I don't even need your loyalty, only your obedience. And if you're gathered here thinking you can orchestrate the same fate for me, I suggest you remember one crucial difference. He loved you. I don't. The silence that followed was absolute. Lord Theron recovered first, his smile now brittle around the edges. Your Grace, I believe you've misunderstood our intentions. Have I? Kadric's gaze swept the table. Then perhaps you can explain why House Valdris has been quietly consolidating military forces along the eastern border, or why Lady Morgana has been meeting with representatives from the capital in secret, or why 3 of you have suddenly developed urgent business that requires extended absences from your territories. He watched the color drain from several faces. You think I don't have eyes in every corner of this realm? You think I've survived this long by being blind to conspiracy? Marcus appeared in the doorway, flanked by 6 guards. The message was clear. Kadric had anticipated this confrontation and prepared accordingly. Now, Kadric said, sitting back down with deliberate calm, we can continue this productive discussion about governance and mercy, or you can all return to your estates and remember that I am not interested in being loved. I'm interested in maintaining order. And anyone who confuses my youth for weakness will learn exactly how my father's son maintains control. The council session ended 20 minutes later with no further challenges. The nobles filed out in carefully maintained silence, their expressions neutral, their thoughts undoubtedly murderous. Kadric remained seated until the last of them had gone. That went well, Marcus said dryly. They'll regroup, Kadric replied. This was just the opening move. What's the next play? We wait. Let them think they've been exposed. Let them panic and make mistakes. Frightened conspirators or careless conspirators. And if they unite against you, then we deal with them the same way we've dealt with every other threat. Kiedric stood, his body aching from the tension he'd held throughout the meeting, ruthlessly. Seraphine Vale was waiting in the red drawing room, a space designed to intimidate guests with its crimson walls and portraits of long-dead Dravenmore ancestors. She stood by the window, her posture straight, her hands clasped in front of her. She wore a simple gray dress that had been expensive once, but now showed signs of careful mending. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, revealing a face that was striking rather than beautiful. High cheekbones, sharp jaw, eyes the color of winter storms. She didn't curtsy when Kiedric entered, didn't lower her gaze, just watched him with the same unflinching directness that had apparently compelled her to walk into Ravenscar and offer herself as payment. "Lady Seraphine," he said, "you have 5 minutes to explain why I shouldn't have you escorted off my property." "Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady, "I'm here to settle my family's debts. Your family's debts are considerable. And last I checked, House Vale possessed nothing of value beyond a crumbling estate and a name nobody wants to be associated with." A flicker of something, pain, anger, crossed her face. "You're correct. My father destroyed everything we had. But I'm not asking for charity or forgiveness. I'm proposing a transaction." Kiedric moved closer, studying her with the same clinical precision he'd used to evaluate a piece on a game board. "What transaction?" "You need a wife." The statement hung in the air like a blade. "I need many things," he said. "A wife isn't among them." "Your counsel thinks otherwise," Seraphine replied. "I heard the whispers on my way in. They believe you're unstable, dangerous. They want you married to soften your image, to make you seem more human. And you think marrying a disgraced noble's daughter would accomplish that?" "I think marrying anyone would accomplish that. The question is whether you choose someone who'll try to control you or someone who has nothing left to lose." Kiedric laughed. It wasn't a kind sound. "You're remarkably candid. I can't afford not to be," she said. "My family is ruined. Our estate will be seized within the month. I have no prospects, no dowry, no value on the marriage market. But I'm educated. I understand court politics. And unlike most of the women you could choose, I'm walking in here with my eyes open about exactly what kind of man you are. And what kind of man is that? The kind who burns villages to maintain order, who executes people for questioning his authority, who rules through fear because he believes anything else is weakness." She stepped closer, her voice dropping. "I'm not here to change you or fix you or make you into something you're not. I'm here because I need protection and you need a shield against your enemies. It's practical, it's cold, and it's honest." Kiedric studied her face, searching for the angle. Everyone had an angle. "What's to stop you from betraying me the moment you have power? The same thing that stopped you from executing those council members today," she replied. "Intelligence. You could have had them all arrested for conspiracy. Instead, you let them walk out of here because you're playing a longer game. I understand that. I respect it. You don't know anything about me. I know you watched your father destroyed by the same nobles who bow to you now. I know you've spent 20 years building walls so high that nobody can touch you. I know you don't trust anyone because trust got your father killed." Her eyes held his. "And I know that every person in your life wants something from you. Loyalty, mercy, weakness. I'm the only one offering you exactly what you need without pretending it's anything else." Kiedric was silent for a long moment. She was right about the council. They'd been pushing him toward marriage for months, convinced it would domesticate him, make him controllable. But this woman standing in front of him, this desperate survivor offering herself as a strategic asset, she understood something the nobles didn't. He had no interest in being saved. "You're asking me to marry you," he said. "What do you get in return?" "Protection, status, survival. The House Vale name restored to a position where my father's sins don't define my entire existence. And if I refuse, then I walk out of here and you eventually marry whoever your council selects. Some well-bred princess who'll spend every day trying to gentle you while secretly reporting your movements back to her family. At least I'm honest about the arrangement." There was a cold logic to it, a transactional clarity that appealed to the part of Kiedric that saw everything as a negotiation. You realize what you're proposing, he said. You'd be tying yourself to the most hated man in the North. Every enemy I have becomes your enemy. Every danger I face becomes your danger. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a survival pact. I know, Seraphine said. I'm counting on it. The betrothal was announced 3 days later. The reaction was exactly what Kaedric expected. Shock, outrage, carefully veiled disgust. The noble houses saw it as further proof of his instability, marrying the daughter of a disgraced embezzler, elevating a fallen family, making decisions based on impulse rather than strategic alliance. Let them think that. Let them believe he was being reckless. The truth was simpler. Seraphine Vale was the only person in the entire realm who'd looked at him and seen exactly what he was without flinching. She didn't want to fix him. She didn't believe in his potential for redemption. She'd walked into Ravenscar with her eyes open and made a deal with the monster. That kind of clear-eyed pragmatism was rarer than loyalty, more valuable than love. The wedding would take place in 1 month. Until then, Seraphine was installed in the east wing of Ravenscar, given chambers befitting her new status as the future duchess. Kaedric made it clear to the household staff she was to be treated with the same respect as any noble wife, regardless of her family's fall from grace. But respect and acceptance were different things. He discovered this truth 2 weeks before the wedding when he found Seraphine in the library, her face carefully neutral, her hands gripping a book so tightly her knuckles had gone white. What happened? He said, not a question. She didn't look up. Nothing. I'm reading. Kaedric moved closer and saw the ripped pages, the damaged binding. Someone had torn the book apart and left it for her to find. Who did this? It doesn't matter, Seraphine said quietly. I can handle it. That's not what I asked. She finally met his eyes. If I tell you, you'll punish them. If you punish them, it proves I can't defend myself. That I need you to fight my battles. It makes me weak. You're going to be Duchess, Kaedric said. People who disrespect you disrespect me. That can't be tolerated. I didn't agree to marry you so you could protect me from petty cruelty, she replied. I agreed because I needed protection from actual threats. There's a difference. He studied her face, the stubborn set of her jaw, the defiance in her eyes, and recognized something he'd never expected to find in another person, the same ruthless pragmatism that had defined his entire life. Fine, he said. Handle it yourself. But when you're ready to name names, I'll make sure the message is clear. She nodded slowly. Thank you. For what? For treating me like I have a spine. The month before the wedding passed in a careful dance of power and perception. Kaedric maintained his iron grip on the northern territories while Seraphine navigated the treacherous waters of court politics. He watched her move through Ravenscar's social hierarchies with the same calculated precision he'd use on a battlefield, identifying allies, neutralizing threats, establishing boundaries. She was good at it, better than he'd expected. But there was something else happening beneath the surface, something neither of them had anticipated. Late one night, 3 days before the wedding, Kaedric found himself in the library. He'd been going over reports of increased bandit activity along the western border when he heard footsteps. Seraphine appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a thick robe against the cold. Can't sleep? He asked. She shook her head. Too much noise in my head. Kaedric understood that. The noise never stopped. The constant calculation of threats, the endless assessment of risks, the perpetual awareness that one mistake could mean destruction. She sat across from him without asking permission. What were you like before? Before what? Before you became this. She gestured at him. The Iron Duke. The man everyone fears. Kaedric set down his papers. I've always been this. I don't believe that. Believe what you want. It won't change reality. Seraphine leaned back in her chair. My father used to say that cruelty was a choice, that people became monsters because they chose power over humanity. Your father was a thief who destroyed your family's legacy, Kaedric said flatly. I'm not sure he's the best authority on moral philosophy. She didn't flinch. You're right, he was weak. He lied to himself about who he was until it was too late, but at least he believed in something beyond survival. And what did that belief get him? Dead, she admitted. Disgraced. Forgotten. Exactly. Kedrick stood, moving toward the window. This is the world we live in. You adapt or you die. You become the predator or you become prey. There is no third option. What about the people who refuse to choose? Then they die confused. Seraphine was silent for a moment. Do you ever wonder what you gave up? Every day, Kedrick said quietly. But wondering doesn't change the equation. I am what I need to be to survive. Nothing more, nothing less. She joined him at the window, both of them staring out at Ravenscar's dark grounds. I'm not going to try to save you, she said. You should know that. I'm not walking into this marriage thinking I can gentle you or fix you or make you into something softer. Good, he replied, because I'd hate to disappoint you. But I do wonder, she continued, whether the man who burns villages and executes rebels ever regrets what he's had to become. Kedrick turned to face her. Regret is a luxury reserved for people who have choices. I don't have that luxury. Everyone has choices. No, he said. They don't. Some people are born into circumstances that strip away every option except survival, and survival requires sacrifices that softer men can't understand. She held his gaze. What did you sacrifice? Everything that made me human, Kedrick said simply, and I'd do it again. The wedding took place in Ravenscar's cathedral under storm-dark skies. Every noble house in the north sent representatives, though Kedrick knew most of them were there to witness what they assumed would be his continued descent into madness. Marrying a disgraced noble's daughter, elevating a fallen house, making emotional decisions that weakened his position. Let them think that. Seraphine walked down the aisle alone, no father to give her away, no family to stand beside her. And Kedrick saw the same unflinching determination that had compelled her to walk into Ravenscar and offer herself as collateral. She wore black instead of white, a deliberate choice that sent a clear message. This wasn't a fairy tale. This was a strategic alliance between two people who understood exactly what they were entering. The ceremony was brief, cold, efficient. When it ended, Duchess Seraphine Dravenmore stood beside her husband and faced the gathered nobles with her chin raised and her eyes challenging anyone to question her right to be there. The reception was worse than the ceremony. Kedrick watched the court move around them like sharks circling wounded prey. Every congratulation was barbed. Every smile was poisonous. Lord Theron approached with his practiced warmth and said all the appropriate things while his eyes assessed Seraphine like a potential weakness to exploit. Lady Morgana was more direct. Such an unexpected match, Your Grace, she said to Seraphine. I'm sure the Duke's decision took everyone by surprise. Including me, Seraphine replied smoothly. But I've learned that the unexpected often yields the most interesting results. Morgana's smile sharpened. Indeed, I do hope you'll adjust well to life at Ravenscar. It can be quite demanding. I'm resilient, Seraphine said. It's a family trait. The barb landed. Morgana's expression flickered before she moved away. Kedrick leaned close to his new wife. You're making enemies. I married you, she replied. I already had enemies. The first attempt on Seraphine's life came 6 days after the wedding. Kedrick found her in her chambers, pale but composed, standing over the body of a servant who'd tried to poison her wine. Marcus had the man in custody, and the interrogation revealed what Kedrick had already suspected. Lord Varon Ashcroft had ordered the assassination, convinced that removing Seraphine would destabilize the Duke. Kedrick stood in Seraphine's sitting room, watching her hands shake as she poured herself water from a pitcher that hadn't been tampered with. Are you hurt? He asked. She shook her head. I saw him add something to the glass. I'm not stupid. No, Kedrick agreed. You're not. What happens now? Now Lord Varon learns what happens to people who touch what belongs to me. The execution was public, brutal, designed to send a message that echoed through every noble house in the realm. The Duchess was under the Duke's protection, and anyone who threatened her would face consequences that made death look merciful. Kedrick stood beside Seraphine on the platform, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his expression carved from ice. When Varon's head rolled across the blood-stained stones, he felt Seraphine's fingers briefly touch his arm, not in horror, but in acknowledgement. She understood. This was the world they lived in now, the world they'd chosen together. That night, back in Ravenscar's private chambers, she said, "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," Kadric replied, "I did." He was one noble among many. Killing him just made the others more determined. "Good," Kadric said. "Let them be determined. Let them unite against me. It's easier to destroy an enemy that reveals itself than one that hides in shadows." Seraphine studied his face in the firelight. "You're using me as bait." "I'm using everything as bait," he corrected, "including myself." She was silent for a long moment. Then, "When this ends badly, and it will, I want you to know I chose this. I walked into Ravenscar knowing exactly who you were, so whatever happens, it's on both of us." Kadric met her eyes. "Nothing's going to happen to you. You can't promise that. Watch me." The conspiracy crystallized 2 months after the wedding. Marcus brought the intelligence to Kadric's study late one night. 7 noble houses had formed an alliance. Their goal was simple: remove the Duke and install someone more manageable. Someone who understood the value of compromise and cooperation. Someone weak. The plan involved simultaneous assassinations across the north, timed to create chaos that would allow the conspirators to seize control before loyalist forces could respond. They'd learned from the attempt on Seraphine. This time, they wouldn't leave anything to chance. Kadric listened to Marcus's report without interruption. When his captain finished, he asked a single question. "Do they know we know?" "No, Your Grace. Our source inside House Valdris confirmed they believe their planning has remained secret." "Good. How long until they move?" 3 weeks? Maybe less." Kadric stood, moving to the window where he'd spent so many mornings watching the northern territories stretch beneath storm-dark skies. "Triple the guard around the Duchess," he said, "and prepare our own response. If they want war, we'll give them exactly that." "Your Grace," Marcus said carefully, 7 houses. That's more than half the northern nobility. Even with our military advantages, the casualties will be acceptable," Kadric finished, "because the alternative is surrendering power to men who'll tear apart everything I've built. I'd rather burn the entire realm to ash than watch that happen." Marcus nodded and left. Alone in his study, Kadric felt the familiar weight of decisions that would cost lives. He'd been here before. He'd be here again. This was what ruling meant, making choices that softer men couldn't stomach, accepting consequences that would destroy lesser lords. The door opened. Seraphine entered without knocking, wrapped in a robe against the cold. "I heard," she said simply. Of course she had. Ravenscar's walls had ears, and Seraphine had proven remarkably adept at cultivating sources. "Then you know what's coming," Kadric said. She moved to stand beside him at the window. 7 houses. Half the north. They're going to come at us with everything. Yes. And you're going to fight them. What other choice is there? Seraphine was quiet for a moment. You could negotiate, find a compromise, give them something that satisfies their ambitions without sacrificing your power. Kadric turned to face her. "You don't believe that?" "No," she admitted. "I don't. Because compromise is just another word for slow surrender. They won't stop until you're dead or broken. The only question is whether you're willing to do what's necessary to survive." He studied her face. This woman who'd walked into Ravenscar and married a monster, who'd stood beside him through assassination attempts and executions, who understood the brutal mathematics of power better than any noble-born lady. "When this starts," he said quietly, "it's going to be ugly. People will die. Innocent people caught in crossfire they don't understand. There won't be mercy or restraint, just violence until one side collapses." "I know," Seraphine said. "You could leave. Take shelter somewhere safe until it's over." She met his eyes. "Where exactly do you think would be safe? They've already tried to kill me once. If you fall, I'm dead anyway. My survival is tied to yours whether I like it or not." "Is that the only reason you're staying?" The question hung between them like something fragile and dangerous. "No," Seraphine said finally. "It's not." Before Kadric could respond, Marcus burst back into the study, his face pale. "Your Grace, they've moved up the timeline. The attack is happening tonight. Houses Valdris, Castell, Greymarch, and 4 others are mobilizing forces. We have maybe 2 hours before they reach Ravenscar. Kedrick's expression went cold and sharp as a blade. "Sound the alarm, seal the gates, and get the Duchess to the inner keep." "I'm not hiding," Seraphine said. "You're not dying either," Kedrick replied. "This is happening, and I need to know you're protected." Their eyes locked. For a moment, the Duke and Duchess stood frozen in a silent battle of wills. Then Seraphine said, "Fine, but when this is over, you're going to tell me why you care." Kedrick didn't answer. There wasn't time. The bells of Ravenscar began to toll, their deep metallic thunder echoing across the northern territories like a warning or a declaration of war. The first wave hit Ravenscar's outer walls 30 minutes after the bells stopped ringing. Kedrick stood on the battlements, watching torchlight spread across the darkness like a disease, counting banners as they emerged from the tree line. House Valdris, House Castell, House Greymarch. 4 more he'd expected, and 2 he hadn't. 9 noble houses total, their combined forces numbering close to 3,000 men against Ravenscar's garrison of 800. The mathematics were simple. He was going to lose people tonight. A lot of people. The only question was whether he could make the cost high enough that the survivors would think twice about trying again. Marcus appeared at his elbow, armor already splashed with blood from skirmishes at the gate. "They're concentrating forces on the eastern wall, trying to punch through before we can reinforce." "Let them try," Kedrick said. "The eastern wall's the strongest section we have. They'll break themselves against it. And when they realize that, they'll try the north gate. That's where we'll be waiting." He turned to face his captain, seeing the question Marcus was too disciplined to ask aloud. "How many of us are going to die tonight?" Kedrick didn't sugarcoat it. Half, maybe more. But they'll lose twice that number, and when morning comes, everyone in the north will know what happens to people who move against Ravenscar. Marcus nodded slowly. "Your Grace, the Duchess, is secured in the inner keep with a full guard rotation. She's safe. She's demanding to see you." Of course she was. Kedrick felt something tighten in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation that took him a moment to identify. Concern. Not for himself, but for the sharp-eyed woman who'd walked into his fortress and somehow become the one person in this entire realm whose survival mattered beyond strategic calculation. "Tell her I'll speak with her when the fighting's done," he said. "I don't think she'll accept that answer." "Then tell her it's not a request. She stays in the keep until I say otherwise." Marcus hesitated, then saluted and disappeared into the chaos of preparations. Kedrick turned back to watch the enemy forces positioning siege equipment, their commanders clearly visible in the torchlight. Lord Theron directing operations with practiced efficiency. Lady Morgana coordinating cavalry movements. They'd planned this well. Timed it for maximum impact. Brought overwhelming force to ensure there'd be no escape. They'd made one critical miscalculation. They assumed he valued his own life enough to surrender when the odds turned impossible. The eastern wall came under assault first. Battering rams, siege ladders, flaming projectiles that turned sections of Ravenscar's ancient stone into an inferno. Kedrick moved through the chaos like a blade cutting through flesh, directing defenders, plugging gaps in the line, personally executing anyone who showed signs of breaking. His sword was wet with blood before the first hour ended. His armor was scorched black from fires he'd waded through to reach endangered positions. This was what ruling actually meant. Not sitting in comfortable chambers making theoretical decisions, standing in the fire, bleeding alongside the people you expected to die for you. Proving through action that you were willing to pay the same price you demanded from others. A messenger found him on the ramparts, gasping for breath. "Your Grace, the north gate's under attack. They broke through the first barrier." "How many? 500. "Maybe more. Lord Theron's leading them personally." Kedrick smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Good. Take a full company and reinforce the gate. I'll be there in 5 minutes, but Your Grace, the eastern wall. We'll hold. The north gate is where we end this." He moved through Ravenscar's corridors with lethal purpose, gathering fighters as he went. 60 men total, all of them bloodied from fighting that had been raging for hours. They looked at their duke and saw something that probably should have terrified them. A man who'd stopped pretending to be civilized, a ruler who'd stripped away every layer of political nicety to reveal the brutal core beneath. When they reached the north gate, the fighting was already savage. Theron's forces had pushed through the outer defenses and were attempting to secure the courtyard. Bodies littered the stones. The air smelled like copper and burning flesh. Cadric drew his sword and waded into the melee without hesitation, his entire being focused on the simple mathematics of survival. Kill the man in front of you. Move to the next. Don't stop. Don't think. Just execute the brutal choreography of close-quarters combat until either you're dead or they are. He found Lord Theron near the center of the fighting, the older noble's expensive armor already dented and bloodstained. Their eyes met across 20 feet of carnage. "Cadric," Theron shouted over the din, "it doesn't have to end like this. Surrender now, and I'll guarantee your life." Cadric cut down the soldier between them and kept moving. "The only guarantee I'm interested in is how many of you I can kill before dawn." They met in a clash of steel that sent sparks flying. Theron was good, better than Cadric expected from a man who'd spent more time in council chambers than on battlefields. But skill meant nothing against someone who'd already accepted that survival required sacrifices most people couldn't imagine making. "Your father would be ashamed," Theron grunted between strikes. "He tried to build something better than this." "My father was destroyed by men like you," Cadric replied, his blade finding gaps in Theron's defense. "Men who promised cooperation while sharpening knives for his back. So don't lecture me about shame while you're attacking my home." He drove Theron back with a combination that should have ended the fight, but the older noble was saved by one of his guards, intercepting the killing blow. The guard died. Theron stumbled backward, blood running from a gash in his sword arm. "Fall back," Theron ordered his forces. "Regroup at the outer wall." The attackers retreated in relatively good order, leaving Ravenscar's defenders bloodied but still holding the gate. Cadric watched them withdraw, counting casualties, calculating odds. They'd lost maybe 100 men. The enemy had lost 3 times that. But the night was far from over. Marcus found him in the courtyard, surveying the damage. "Your Grace, we can't sustain this. They're going to keep coming until they break through. Then we make sure they pay enough that winning doesn't feel like victory," Cadric said. "Prepare the courtyard defenses. Next time they push through that gate, we turn this entire space into a killing ground. And if that's not enough?" Cadric met his captain's eyes. "Then we fall back to the keep and make them dig us out stone by stone. But I'm not surrendering, not to them, not to anyone." Seraphine was exactly where Cadric expected to find her when he finally made it to the inner keep. Standing in the war room, studying maps of Ravenscar's defenses with an intensity that suggested she'd been there for hours. She'd changed out of her court dress into something more practical, dark fabric that wouldn't show blood, her hair pulled back severely. She looked up when he entered, her gaze cataloging his injuries with clinical precision. "You're hurt." "I'm breathing," Cadric replied. "That's all that matters." "How bad is it?" He moved to the table, positioning markers on the map to show current enemy positions. "Bad. They have the numbers, we have the position. It's going to come down to who breaks first." Seraphine studied the map. "They're concentrating on the north and east." "What about the western approach?" "Cliffs. No realistic way to bring forces up that route without massive casualties." She traced a line along the map with one finger. "What if that's exactly what they're planning? Send a small force up the cliffs as a distraction, pull defenders away from the main assault points? They'd lose everyone they sent up that route. Would they care?" Seraphine looked at him directly. "These aren't professional soldiers, Cadric. They're noble house guards, expendable. If sacrificing 200 men on a suicide climb means they can punch through your actual defenses, they'd consider it a bargain." He studied the map with fresh eyes, seeing the tactical opportunity he'd dismissed as too costly. She was right. The nobles attacking Ravenscar weren't operating under the same constraints as a professional military force. They had resources to burn and political motivations that made casualties acceptable. "How did you see that?" "Because I've been sitting in this room for 6 hours thinking about how I'd destroy this fortress if I wanted you dead," she said flatly. "It's not complicated. You've built something impressive, but impressive just means it requires more bodies to overcome." Cadric called for Marcus and ordered additional forces to the western approaches. When the captain left, Seraphine said quietly, "You need to tell me the truth. Can we hold?" Honest answer? "I don't know. We're bleeding them, but they can afford to bleed. We can't. Then what's the plan when the walls fall? There was no gentle way to say it. I get you out. Everything else is secondary. Seraphine laughed. It was a bitter sound. You're going to sacrifice your fortress, your people, your entire position in the north to save one disgraced noble's daughter? Yes. The single word hung between them like a confession. Why? She demanded. I'm not worth that. We both know this marriage was strategic, a shield against your enemies. I'm disposable. Kadric moved closer, his voice dropping to something dangerous. You stopped being disposable the moment you stood in my drawing room and didn't flinch. When you looked at what I am and didn't try to fix it, or change it, or pretend it was something else. Do you understand how rare that is? Everyone in my life wants me to be different, softer, more merciful, more controllable. You're the only person who accepted what I actually am. That doesn't make me special, Seraphine said. It makes me pragmatic. Call it whatever you want. But if this fortress falls and I have to choose between holding Ravenscar and keeping you alive, Ravenscar burns. Her expression shifted, something vulnerable breaking through the careful composure. You can't mean that. Watch me. Before she could respond, an explosion shook the keep's foundation. Dust rained from the ceiling. Somewhere in the distance, men were screaming. They're using siege engines, Kadric said, already moving toward the door. The big ones we didn't expect them to bring. What does that mean? It means they're willing to level this entire fortress to kill me. He paused at the doorway. Stay here. That's not a request. Kadric, she said, and something in her voice made him turn. If you die tonight, what happens to me? You get out. Marcus has orders. There's a passage beneath the keep that leads to the river. He'll make sure you reach safety. And then what? I'm still the disgraced Duke's widow, still a target, still... You survive, he interrupted. Whatever it takes. You find safety and you rebuild. That's the deal. What deal? The one we made when you walked into Ravenscar and married a monster. You survive, no matter what it costs. The western approach turned into exactly the bloodbath Seraphine predicted. 200 enemy soldiers scaling cliffs in the darkness, trying to reach Ravenscar's less defended walls. Kadric's forces were waiting. The slaughter was efficient and brutal, bodies tumbling back down the cliff face, screams echoing across the night. But it was a distraction. While defenders focused on the western approach, the main assault broke through the north gate. Theron's forces poured into the courtyard, overwhelming Kadric's prepared defenses through sheer numbers. The fighting devolved into close-quarters chaos, every foot of ground contested with savage determination. Kadric found himself fighting back-to-back with Marcus, both of them drenched in blood, their movements synchronized through years of combat experience. The courtyard was a nightmare of steel and screaming, fires burning out of control, the ancient stones of Ravenscar running red. We can't hold this, Marcus shouted over the din. We need to fall back to the keep. Not yet, Kadric replied, driving his sword through an enemy soldier's throat. Make them pay for every inch. Your Grace, if we wait too long... I said not yet. But even as he gave the order, Kadric knew Marcus was right. The mathematics had turned inevitable. They were going to lose the courtyard, lose the outer defenses, be pushed back into the keep itself. The only question was how many enemies he could kill before that happened. Lady Morgana appeared through the smoke, her armor pristine, her expression calculating. She'd stayed back from the initial assault, letting others bleed while she assessed the situation. Smart, ruthless, exactly what Kadric would have done. Duke Dravenmore, she called out, this ends now. Surrender and I'll guarantee your wife's safety. Kadric laughed. It was a terrible sound, empty of humor. You think I trust guarantees from someone attacking my home? Then she dies with you. She was never part of this, Kadric said, killing another soldier who got too close. Let her leave and I'll give you Ravenscar without further resistance. Morgana smiled. We both know you're lying. The moment she's safe, you'll burn this fortress to the ground rather than let us take it intact. You're right, but I thought I'd try diplomacy. Their forces clashed again, and in the chaos, Kadric saw his opportunity. A gap in the enemy line. A clear path back to the keep. He made the call he'd been avoiding. Fall back, he ordered. Everyone to the inner keep, now. The retreat was orderly chaos, defenders pulling back through corridors they'd trapped, and prepared for exactly this scenario. Kedrick was the last through, personally sealing the massive iron doors that separated the keep from the rest of Ravenscar. The sound of them closing was final. Absolute. They were trapped now, locked inside the most defensible position in the north, with no escape except the secret passage beneath the foundation. The enemy controlled everything else. Seraphine met him in the great hall, her face pale but composed. I heard the explosions. How bad? We lost the courtyard, the outer defenses, everything except this building. So we're besieged. Effectively, yes. How long can we hold? Kaedric looked around the great hall at the exhausted defenders, the wounded being treated against the walls, the supplies they'd managed to secure. Days. Maybe a week if we're careful. But they'll try to starve us out or burn us out. Either way, time's not on our side. Then why are we still here? Because I'm not ready to surrender, he said simply. And because the moment we run, they win. Every noble house in the north learns that overwhelming force is enough to break me. That becomes the template for every future challenge to my authority. So we're staying out of pride. We're staying because power only means something when you're willing to die for it. Seraphine moved closer, close enough that he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. You know this is insane. You know there's no rational reason to keep fighting. Since when did you expect rationality from me? She almost smiled. Fair point. A messenger interrupted, one of Marcus's lieutenants. Your Grace, they're moving siege equipment into position. Looks like they're planning to bombard the keep. Of course they were. Theron and Morgana weren't stupid. They knew time favored them. The faster they could force a resolution, the less chance Kaedric had to pull off some desperate gambit. Reinforce the walls, Kaedric ordered. Move wounded to the lower levels. Prepare for sustained bombardment. When the lieutenant left, Seraphine said quietly, Kaedric, you need to let me go. Use the passage. Get me out while you can still bargain. No, this is pointless. You're throwing away everything you've built for you, he interrupted. Yes, that's exactly what I'm doing. Why? The question had been building between them for months, since the wedding, since the first assassination attempt, since she'd stood beside him through executions and political maneuvering and all the brutal realities of his rule. Because you're the only person in my entire life who looked at me and didn't want me to be something different, Kaedric said. Everyone else, my father, the nobles, even Marcus sometimes, they all saw potential for redemption. Some better version of me buried beneath the cruelty. But you never did. You saw exactly what I am and decided that was enough. That's not a reason to die. It's the only reason that matters. Before she could respond, the first siege engine fired. The impact shook the entire keep, stones cracking, dust raining from above. The bombardment had begun. The siege lasted 3 days. 72 hours of constant assault, the enemy methodically destroying Ravenscar's outer walls while Kaedric's forces held the keep through sheer bloody-minded determination. Sleep became a luxury nobody could afford. Food ran low. Water even lower. The wounded kept dying despite everything the healers could do. On the morning of the 4th day, Marcus found Kaedric on the battlements, staring out at the enemy encampment. The captain's armor was dented beyond recognition. His face was gray with exhaustion. Your Grace, we can't sustain this. We're down to 200 effective fighters. The walls are compromised in 3 sections. They could breach the keep by nightfall. I know, Kaedric said. Then what are we doing? Surviving. 1 more day, 1 more hour, whatever we can manage. Marcus was silent for a long moment. Permission to speak freely, Your Grace? Granted, this isn't about survival anymore. This is about not admitting defeat, and I understand that. I followed you for 20 years because you're the strongest leader I've ever served. But strength means knowing when to preserve what matters for another fight. You think I should surrender. I think you should save the Duchess. Get her out. Live to rebuild. This fortress is stone and mortar. It can be retaken. But if you die here, everything you've built dies with you. Kaedric turned to face his captain. And if I run, every noble house in the north learns that I fold when pressed hard enough. That becomes my legacy. The Duke who abandoned Ravenscar when the fight got difficult. Better that than the Duke who died for pride. It's not pride, Kaedric said quietly. It's the only thing I have left that's real. If I surrender now, I become what they always wanted, controllable, broken, a cautionary tale about rulers who forget their place. Then let me ask you something, Your Grace. What would the Duchess want you to do? The question hit harder than Kaedric expected. He knew the answer. Seraphine would want him to survive. She'd made that clear a dozen times over the past 3 days. She'd begged him to use the passage, to escape while they still could, to preserve something worth fighting for. But survival without power was just slow death wearing a different name. I can't, he said finally. I can't be what they want me to be. I'd rather die as myself than live as their puppet. Marcus nodded slowly. Then we hold. Whatever comes. Uamt. The breach came at sunset on the 4th day. Enemy forces punched through the eastern wall of the keep, flooding into corridors that had never been designed for this kind of defensive fighting. Kaedric met them with the remaining defenders, turning every hallway into a killing ground, every doorway into a choke point. The fighting was intimate and brutal, no room for tactical maneuvering, just steel and fury in spaces so confined that bodies piled up and became obstacles. Kaedric fought like something inhuman, his sword moving in patterns burned into muscle memory through decades of combat. Kill, move, kill again, don't stop, don't think, just survive the next 30 seconds, and then the 30 seconds after that. He found Seraphine in the Great Hall, surrounded by the last circle of defenders. She'd taken up a sword herself, something he'd never seen her do, and was standing her ground with grim determination, not skilled, but committed, willing to die fighting rather than surrender. Their eyes met across the chaos. In that moment, Kaedric understood exactly what he'd been fighting for. Not power, not legacy, not even survival. Just the simple, devastating truth that this woman had become the only thing in his entire existence that mattered more than control. Get to the passage, he ordered. Now. Not without you, she replied. Seraphine. No. She cut through an enemy soldier with surprising efficiency. Whatever happens, we face it together. That was the deal. He wanted to argue, wanted to force her into the passage at sword point if necessary. But there was no time. The enemy was pouring through the breach faster than they could kill them. The mathematics had finally turned impossible. Kaedric grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the back of the Great Hall, where a hidden door led to the passage beneath the keep. Marcus and 20 defenders formed a rearguard, buying them precious seconds with their lives. The passage was narrow and dark, water seeping through ancient stones. Kaedric led Seraphine through the darkness with one hand on the wall and the other gripping his sword. Behind them, the sounds of fighting grew distant but never quite disappeared. They emerged from the passage a quarter-mile from Ravenscar, near the river where Marcus had positioned horses and supplies. Dawn was breaking over the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of blood and ash. From their vantage point, they could see Ravenscar Keep burning, enemy banners already flying from towers that had belonged to House Dravenmore for centuries. Everything Kaedric had built was gone. His fortress, his power, his position in the north, all of it consumed by flames while he stood in the mud and watched. Seraphine's hand found his. Her fingers were cold. What happens now? Kaedric stared at the burning ruins of his legacy, feeling something crack open inside his chest. An emotion he'd spent his entire life trying to destroy because it made men weak, and weakness got you killed. But standing there with Seraphine's hand in his, watching everything he'd sacrificed his humanity to build turn to ash, Kaedric finally understood what his father had been trying to tell him all those years ago. Power without something worth protecting was just another prison. Control without connection was just elaborate suicide. Now, he said quietly, we survive. We rebuild. And we make every single person who attacked Ravenscar regret that they didn't kill me when they had the chance. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something that made her expression shift. You're not going to let this go. Not ever. Even if it costs everything? I already lost everything, Kaedric said. The only question is whether I get it back or burn down everyone who took it from me in the attempt. Seraphine was silent for a moment, watching flames consume the keep. Then, I need you to understand something. I didn't marry you because I wanted protection. I married you because I recognized what you are. Someone who'd rather die than submit. And I'm the same way. So if we're doing this, if we're rebuilding from nothing and taking revenge on everyone who tried to destroy us, you need to know I'm not your victim. I'm your partner. And that means you don't make decisions about my survival without consulting me. Kadric met her eyes. Even if those decisions might save your life, especially then. The sun continued rising, indifferent to their conversation. In the distance, they could hear sounds of celebration from the enemy forces. Nobles who thought they'd won, who believed destroying Ravenscar meant destroying the Duke. They were wrong. Kadric took one last look at his burning fortress, committing the image to memory. This was the price of showing weakness, of allowing connection, of caring about something beyond pure survival. His father had been destroyed by that same mistake, letting people close enough to hurt him. But standing there with Seraphine's hand in his, Kadric made a different choice than his father had. He wouldn't close himself off, wouldn't retreat into isolation. Instead, he'd weaponize it, turn connection into strength rather than weakness. Use the very thing that should make him vulnerable as the foundation for something far more dangerous than fear. The nobles thought they'd broken him by taking Ravenscar. They'd actually just removed the last constraint on how ruthless he could become. "We need to move," he said. "They'll send patrols once they secure the keep." "Where are we going?" "South. To the capital. If the northern nobles think they can move against House Dravenmore without consequences, we're going to teach them exactly what consequences look like." Seraphine mounted her horse with practiced ease. "And how do we do that? We have no army, no fortress, no political backing. We're refugees." Kadric swung into his saddle, his eyes never leaving the burning keep. "That's what makes us dangerous. Men with everything to lose make calculated decisions. Men with nothing left have no reason to hold back." They rode south as the sun climbed higher, leaving Ravenscar behind. But Kadric could still feel the heat of those flames against his back, burning away everything except the core truth he'd spent 20 years trying to deny. Power wasn't enough. Control wasn't enough. Survival without purpose was just waiting to die. He'd lost his fortress, lost his position, lost everything that had defined him for 2 decades. But he'd gained something far more dangerous, a reason to fight that had nothing to do with maintaining order or preserving authority. For the first time in his life, Duke Kadric Dravenmore was fighting for something beyond himself. And that made him unstoppable. They reached the capital 3 weeks later, traveling through back roads and avoiding major settlements. News of Ravenscar's fall had spread across the realm like wildfire. The story being told wasn't the truth. It was a carefully constructed narrative about a tyrannical duke finally brought to justice by noble lords acting in the kingdom's best interest. Kadric listened to the lies being spread in taverns and market squares, heard himself described as a monster who'd terrorized the north, a brutal despot who'd murdered innocents and crushed dissent. The propaganda was effective because it contained just enough truth to be believable. What they didn't mention was why he'd become that. The years of watching his father destroyed by the same nobles now pretending to be heroes. The calculated brutality required to survive in a world where mercy got you killed. The impossible choices that turned men into monsters or corpses. Seraphine listened to the same stories with a different kind of anger. These people have no idea what actually happened. They're believing whatever narrative makes them feel good about themselves. "That's how power works," Kadric said. "Whoever controls the story controls the truth. Right now they're controlling both. So what do? We change the story." They entered the capital under false identities, a minor merchant and his wife fleeing northern conflicts. Nobody looked twice at refugees. The city was full of them. Kadric used the anonymity to gather intelligence, building a picture of the political landscape that had formed in the wake of Ravenscar's fall. What he discovered was both predictable and useful. The noble coalition that had attacked him was already fracturing. Lord Theron and Lady Morgana were fighting over who should control the northern territories. House Valdris was making power plays that threatened House Castell's interests. The alliance built on mutual hatred of the Duke was collapsing now that their common enemy was gone. Perfect. Kadric spent 3 days mapping out every crack in the coalition, every rivalry, every competing interest. Then he started applying pressure to the weakest points. Anonymous letters revealing secret dealings, carefully planted rumors about betrayals, evidence of conspiracies that may or may not have actually existed. He was dismantling their alliance the same way they'd tried to dismantle him, through politics and manipulation instead of direct confrontation. Seraphine watched him work with something approaching awe. "You're better at this than the fighting. Fighting's just another form of negotiation," Kaedric replied. "Sometimes you use swords. Sometimes you use information. The principles are the same. Identify your opponent's weaknesses and exploit them until they break. And when they figure out it's you, then we move to the next phase, which is..." He looked at her with an expression that would have terrified anyone who didn't know him. Revenge. The first target was Lord Varen's younger brother, who'd taken control of House Ashcroft after Varen's execution. Kaedric arranged for evidence of the brother's involvement in smuggling operations to reach the Crown's investigators. The man was arrested within a week. House Ashcroft's assets were seized. Their political influence evaporated overnight, one down. The second target was more complex. Lady Isadora Greymarch had positioned herself as a voice of reason in the coalition, the moderate who'd only reluctantly joined the attack on Ravenscar. Kaedric destroyed that carefully constructed image by leaking documents proving she'd been planning the assault for months. Her own allies turned on her. She was forced to withdraw from court in disgrace. 2 down. The third target was personal. Lord Theron Valdris, who'd led the assault that destroyed Ravenscar, who'd offered surrender terms he never intended to honor. Kaedric didn't go after Theron directly. Instead, he systematically dismantled every business venture, every political alliance, every source of revenue that House Valdris relied on. It took 6 weeks. When he was done, Theron was bankrupt and powerless, reduced to begging for loans from people who'd once feared him. 3 down. Seraphine watched the campaign unfold with growing understanding. You're not trying to kill them. You're trying to break them the way they broke you. Death's too quick, Kaedric said. I want them to feel what it's like to lose everything, to watch their power stripped away piece by piece, to understand exactly what they took from me. And Lady Morgana? She's different, smarter, more dangerous. She won't fall for the same tactics. So what's the plan? Kaedric smiled. It wasn't a kind expression. We give her exactly what she wants. What? Lady Morgana Castell had emerged from Ravenscar's fall as the dominant power in the north. With Theron weakened and the other coalition members scattered, she'd consolidated control over territories that had once belonged to House Dravenmore. She was positioning herself as the new authority in the region, building the same kind of power base Kaedric had once commanded. She'd made one critical mistake. She assumed Kaedric was either dead or too broken to pose a threat. He arranged a meeting through intermediaries, a private dinner in a neutral location. Just the two of them, discussing potential terms for Kaedric's permanent exile from the north. Morgana agreed immediately. She wanted the satisfaction of seeing him humbled, wanted to watch him beg for scraps. The dinner took place in a private room at one of the capital's most expensive establishments. Morgana arrived dressed in clothes that screamed power and wealth. Kaedric wore simple merchant's garb, playing the part of a fallen duke with nothing left to bargain with. They sat across from each other while servants poured wine and disappeared. Duke Dravenmore, Morgana said, her tone dripping false sympathy. Or should I simply call you Kaedric now? I understand you've lost the right to your title. The title's just a word, he replied. Words don't interest me. Then what does? Survival, same as everyone, she smiled. How practical. I'd heard you were more idealistic. The stories painted you as a man who'd rather die than compromise. The stories were wrong. Morgana studied him, searching for the angle. What are you proposing? Safe passage out of the realm. Enough resources to establish myself somewhere that doesn't care about northern politics. In exchange, I publicly renounce any claim to House Dravenmore's territories and titles. That's all? That's all. She leaned back in her chair. You're really that beaten? I'm really that tired, Kaedric said. I spent 20 years fighting. It cost me everything. I'm done. The lie was perfect because it contained the emotional truth. He was tired. He had lost everything. The only dishonest part was the surrender. Morgana considered the offer, her calculating mind working through implications. If you truly mean this, I could be convinced to support your request, perhaps even provide modest financial backing for your new start. That's generous. I'm not without compassion, she said. Despite what you might believe, I took no pleasure in destroying Ravenscar. It was necessary. You'd become too dangerous, too unstable. But that doesn't mean I want to see you destitute. The performance was masterful. Kadric almost believed she actually cared. There is one condition, Morgana continued. Your wife. Lady Seraphine. She remains in the realm. Her family's debts to the crown need to be addressed. Kadric's expression didn't change. That's not negotiable. Then neither is my support. She stays with me or there's no deal. Morgana's smile sharpened. You're not in a position to make demands, Kadric. Without my backing, you'll spend the rest of your life running from bounty hunters and assassins. Is that really worth protecting one woman? Yes. The single word carried absolute conviction. Morgana studied him for a long moment, and he saw the exact instant she realized the truth. You're not here to negotiate. You're here for something else. Kadric's hand moved to the knife concealed in his coat, but before he could act, Seraphine stepped out from behind a decorative screen, a crossbow aimed directly at Morgana's chest. Actually, Seraphine said, we're here for you. Morgana didn't flinch. Impressive. Though, if you shoot me, my guards will kill you both before you reach the door. Your guards are currently unconscious, Kadric said. Poisoned wine delivered by servants we replaced with our own people. We've been planning this for weeks. The color drained from Morgana's face as she realized the trap had already closed. What do you want? What I've always wanted, Kadric replied. Everything you took from me. And you're going to help me get it back. But they kept Morgana prisoner for 3 days in a safe house outside the capital. 3 days of careful persuasion that fell somewhere between negotiation and torture. Kadric never touched her, never raised his voice, just systematically explained exactly what would happen if she didn't cooperate. By the end, she was ready to help. The plan was simple but devastating. Morgana would return to the north and announce she'd discovered evidence that the attack on Ravenscar had been based on false pretenses, that Kadric had been framed by foreign agents trying to destabilize the realm, that the entire coalition had been manipulated into destroying an innocent duke. It was a complete fabrication, but it was also plausible enough that people would believe it if delivered by someone with Morgana's credibility. Why would I do this? She demanded. It destroys everything I've built. Because if you don't, Kadric said quietly, I release evidence of your actual crimes. The embezzlement, the murder of your first husband, the deals you made with enemy kingdoms to undermine the crown. All of it documented, all of it verified. You're bluffing. He placed a folder on the table between them. Read it yourself. Morgana spent an hour going through the documents, her expression growing more stricken with each page. When she finished, she looked at Kadric with something approaching respect. How long have you been gathering this? Since before Ravenscar fell, he admitted. I've been documenting the crimes of every major noble house for years. Insurance against exactly this situation. You're a monster. I'm a survivor. There's a difference. And if I cooperate, if I destroy my own reputation to restore yours, then these documents never see daylight. You live quietly, retire from politics, enjoy whatever years you have left. It's not mercy, it's pragmatism. You're more useful to me as a cautionary tale than a corpse. Morgana was silent for a long time. Finally, you'll never be what you were. Even if I clear your name, the northern nobles won't follow you again. They know what you're capable of now. Good, Kadric said. Fear's more reliable than loyalty, anyway. Morgana's confession rocked the realm. Within a week, the entire narrative about Ravenscar had reversed. Kadric went from tyrant to victim. The nobles who'd attacked him scrambled to distance themselves from the coalition. Investigations were launched. Assets were frozen. Kadric watched it unfold from the capital, his hand moving pieces on a board only he could see clearly. This wasn't about restoring his reputation. It was about creating enough chaos that he could rebuild power without interference. 3 months after Ravenscar fell, he was summoned to the royal court. The king himself wanted to meet with the duke, who'd supposedly been wronged by his own nobles. Kadric accepted the invitation, knowing it was another kind of trap, but also an opportunity. The throne room was exactly as he remembered from his youth, opulent, intimidating, designed to remind visitors of their insignificance. The king sat on his throne looking old and tired, a man who'd ruled for 30 years and was exhausted by the weight of it. Duke Dravenmore, the king said, we owe you an apology. The investigation has revealed grave injustices committed against your house. Cedric bowed. Your Majesty is too kind. I seek no apology, only the opportunity to serve the realm as my family has for generations. The king studied him. You wish to reclaim your territories? I wish to rebuild what was destroyed. Not for pride, but because the North needs stability. And stability requires leadership that understands the region's complexities. And you believe you're that leader? I know I am. The king was silent for a moment. Very well. Your titles and territories are restored. Ravenscar Keep will be rebuilt at crown expense. You have our full support in re-establishing order in the north. Cedric bowed again, hiding his expression. This was what power looked like when you played the game correctly, getting people to give you what you wanted while believing it was their idea. There is one condition, the king continued. You will take a seat on my council, report regularly on northern affairs. The days of ruling your territories as an independent fiefdom are over. From now on, House Dravenmore answers to the crown. Of course, Your Majesty. It was a restriction designed to limit his power, keep him controlled. The king had learned from Cedric's father's mistakes. Give a duke too much independence and he becomes dangerous. But restrictions only mattered if you followed them. Cedric left the throne room with everything he needed: legitimacy, resources, and official backing. The crown thought they'd domesticated him, made him safe. They were wrong. Reconstruction of Ravenscar began immediately. Cedric poured every resource into rebuilding not just the physical structure, but the power base that had been destroyed. New alliances, new armies, new systems of control that were harder to dismantle than what he'd had before. Seraphine stood beside him through all of it, no longer the desperate noble's daughter, but the duchess who'd survived a siege and emerged stronger. Together they rebuilt House Dravenmore into something that made the old version look tame by comparison. But something had changed. The man who'd ruled through pure fear and calculation now had something else driving him, something more dangerous than ambition or survival instinct. Purpose. Late one night, standing in the partially rebuilt Great Hall of Ravenscar, Seraphine asked him, Do you ever regret it? Regret what? Everything. The choices you made, the person you became, the price you paid for power. Cedric looked at her. This woman who'd walked into his fortress and somehow become the reason he kept fighting, every day. Then why keep going? Because regret changes nothing. The past is fixed, but the future is still being written. And I intend to write it in a way that ensures nobody ever takes from me again. Even if that costs your humanity. I lost that a long time ago. He moved closer to her. But I found something else, something I didn't expect and didn't plan for, and I'm keeping it no matter what it costs. She met his eyes. You mean me? Yes. Seraphine was quiet for a moment. You understand this can't last. Whatever we've built, whatever we've become to each other, the world we live in destroys things like this. Connection makes you vulnerable. Love makes you weak. Then we'll be vulnerable and weak together, Cedric said. And God's help anyone who tries to use it against us. Outside, thunder rolled across the northern territories. A storm was coming, literal and metaphorical. The nobles who'd attacked Ravenscar were regrouping. New threats were emerging. The king's restrictions were tightening. But standing in the ruins of everything he'd lost and rebuilt, Duke Cedric Dravenmore finally understood the truth his father had died trying to teach him. Power without purpose was just elaborate suicide. Control without connection was just another kind of prison. He'd spent 20 years becoming a monster to survive. Now he was going to spend the rest of his life being something far more dangerous, a monster with something to protect. And that changed everything. This story is entirely fictional and created solely for entertainment. 6 months after Ravenscar's restoration, Cedric discovered the first crack in his rebuilt empire. It came in the form of a letter delivered by a messenger who died before he could be questioned. Poison, fast-acting, professional. The letter itself was unsigned, written in a hand Cedric didn't recognize, but the contents made his blood run cold. Your captain knows what you did to Lord Varen's family. Ask him about the children. Kedrick read the words 3 times, searching for the angle. Varen's execution had been public and justified. The man had tried to assassinate Seraphine. But the children, that was different. That was the part of the story nobody talked about. The part Kedrick had handled personally in the dungeons beneath Ravenscar while the court celebrated justice being served. He'd ordered Marcus to bury the evidence, to ensure nobody ever learned that House Ashcroft's entire bloodline had been eliminated, not just the lord who'd committed treason, children included. Because leaving heirs alive meant leaving threats that would grow into revenge 20 years down the line. Marcus had carried out the orders without question, or so Kedrick had believed. He found his captain in the training yard drilling new recruits with the same methodical precision that had made him invaluable for 2 decades. Marcus looked up when Kedrick approached, his expression neutral, professional. Always professional. Your Grace? Something wrong? Kedrick handed him the letter. You tell me. Marcus read it slowly, his face betraying nothing. Then he folded the paper and handed it back. Someone's trying to create division. Standard tactic. Is it true? Marcus met his eyes. Is what true? Do you know what I did to Varen's children? Of course I know. I buried them myself. The answer was too calm, too controlled. Kedrick felt something shift in his perception, like watching a familiar landscape reveal hidden depths. When you buried them, did you tell anyone else? Just the men who helped. 5 total. All loyal. Are they? Marcus didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched between them, filled with the clash of practice swords and shouted commands from the training yard. Your Grace, if you're asking whether I've been compromised, the answer is no. But if you're asking whether the men under my command can be bought, we both know everyone has a price. Find out who sent this letter, Kedrick said. I want names by sunset. Understood. Kedrick watched his captain walk away, searching for any sign of deception or guilt. Marcus moved with the same steady confidence he always had, giving nothing away, which meant either he was innocent or he was better at lying than Kedrick had ever suspected. Both possibilities were dangerous. But the investigation revealed nothing useful. The messenger had been hired through intermediaries. The poison was common enough to be untraceable. The paper and ink were standard merchant stock available in any city. Whoever sent the letter had been careful to leave no trail, but the damage was already done. Doubt had entered Kedrick's carefully constructed world like poison in a wound. He found himself watching Marcus differently, analyzing every word, every gesture, searching for signs of betrayal. The captain who'd stood beside him for 20 years suddenly felt like a stranger wearing a familiar face. Seraphine noticed immediately. She cornered him in their private chambers 3 days after the letter arrived, her expression sharp with concern. You're spiraling, she said without preamble. I can see it. Talk to me. Kedrick handed her the letter. He'd been carrying it like a talisman, reading it over and over, searching for clues he might have missed. She read it quickly, her jaw tightening. This is about the Ashcroft children. You knew? Of course I knew. I'm not blind. You think I didn't notice an entire family disappearing after their patriarch committed treason? And you said nothing. What was there to say? She set the letter down carefully. You did what you believed was necessary. I married you knowing what you're capable of. Finding out you're thorough doesn't change that. Someone else knows, Kedrick said. Someone close enough to have details. And they're using it as leverage. Or they're trying to make you paranoid, turn you against your own people. Classic destabilization tactic. She was right. Kedrick knew she was right. But knowledge didn't stop the corrosive spread of suspicion through his thoughts. Power required trust, and trust required vulnerability, and vulnerability was exactly what got men killed. I need to know who sent this, he said, because if it's Marcus, then you deal with it the way you deal with every threat, Seraphine interrupted. Decisively. But you don't burn down your entire command structure based on one anonymous letter. And if I'm wrong, if I trust him and he betrays me, then you made a mistake. She moved closer, her voice softening slightly. But you've built your entire life around never trusting anyone. At some point, that stops being protection and starts being another kind of prison. I can't afford to be wrong. You can't afford to be alone either. The words hit harder than Kedrick expected. He'd spent so long building walls, eliminating threats, ensuring nobody could get close enough to hurt him. But standing in their chambers with Seraphine watching him spiral into paranoia, he understood the trap he'd constructed. Safety through isolation meant dying surrounded by enemies who couldn't actually reach you, which was just another form of defeat. "What do you suggest?" he asked. "Test him. Give Marcus information that only he knows. See if it leaks. If he's loyal, nothing happens. If he's compromised, you'll have proof. And if the test itself pushes him toward betrayal, then he was never truly loyal to begin with," Seraphine said. "You can't save people from their own choices." The test was elegant in its simplicity. Kadric told Marcus about a fictional shipment of gold arriving from the capital, payment for reconstruction efforts, valuable enough to attract thieves, vulnerable enough to be worth attacking. He provided specific details: route, timing, guard complement, information that would be irresistible to anyone looking to damage House Dravenmoor's finances. Then he waited. 3 days later, bandits attacked the convoy. Except there was no gold. Just soldiers dressed as merchants, waiting in ambush. The bandits were cut down efficiently, and the survivors were brought to Ravenscar's dungeons for questioning. Kedrick descended into those familiar stone corridors with Seraphine beside him, both of them wearing expressions that would have terrified anyone with sense. The lead bandit was already strapped to the interrogation chair, bleeding from wounds inflicted during capture. "Who told you about the gold?" Kadric asked without preamble. The bandit spat blood. "Go fuck yourself." Kadric nodded to the torturer standing in the shadows. The screaming started immediately. Professional, efficient, designed to extract information without killing the subject too quickly. After 10 minutes, the bandit broke. "A man in Ravenscar. Paid us to hit the convoy. Said it would be easy money." "What man?" "Didn't give a name, just met us in a tavern. Described the route, provided coin up front. Describe him." The bandit's description matched half the men in Ravenscar's garrison. Brown hair, average height. Scar on his left hand. Could have been anyone. Kedrick felt frustration building like pressure behind his eyes. The lead was useless, deliberately vague, which meant either the bandit was lying or the person who hired him had been careful to remain anonymous. He tried a different approach. "How did he know to find you?" Said he'd been asking around, looking for people willing to work outside the law. "Who recommended you?" The bandit hesitated, and Kaedric saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. Truth or loyalty? Pain or silence? The torturer moved closer. "Captain Marcus," the bandit gasped. "Said the captain vouched for us. Said we could trust the job." The words landed like a physical blow. Kaedric felt the world narrow to a single point of certainty. Betrayal. Not from a stranger or distant enemy, but from the man who'd stood beside him for 20 years. The man he'd trusted with his life. "You're certain," Kaedric said, his voice deadly quiet. "On my life. The captain's the one who connected us." Kaedric turned to leave, but Seraphine caught his arm. "Wait. This is too clean, too obvious. He was tortured. People don't lie under torture." "Smart people do," she replied, "especially if they're told what to say beforehand." Kaedric looked at the bandit again, seeing him with fresh eyes. The wounds were painful, but not crippling. The breaks were clean. The torture had been professional, yes, but also remarkably brief for someone supposedly withholding critical information. "Who really sent you?" he asked. The bandit's expression flickered. Just for a second. But it was enough. Kaedric moved faster than the torturer could react, his knife finding the bandit's throat in one smooth motion. Blood sprayed across ancient stone. The body slumped in the chair. "Why did you do that?" Seraphine demanded. "We needed him." "No," Kaedric said, wiping his blade clean. "We needed to see who panics when he dies. Someone set this up. Someone wanted me to think Marcus betrayed me, and they just lost their primary witness. So what now? Now we see who tries to run." Nobody ran. That was the first surprise. The second was Marcus himself, who appeared in Kaedric's study that evening without being summoned, his expression carefully neutral. "Your Grace, I heard about the bandit. About what he said." Kaedric studied his captain from behind the desk. And I want you to know it's bullshit. I never met those men. Never hired them. Someone's setting me up. Why you? Because I'm the only person in this fortress you actually trust. Take me out and you're alone. Easier to control. The logic was sound. Too sound. Which meant either Marcus was innocent and smart enough to see the trap, or he was guilty and smart enough to predict Kadrick's reasoning. Where were you 3 nights ago? Kadrick asked. When the bandits say you met them in the tavern. On duty. Checking perimeter defenses with Lieutenant Gareth. He'll confirm. I'm sure he will. Kadrick stood, moving to the window. The question is whether Gareth is covering for you or telling the truth. Your Grace, Marcus said carefully. I've served you for 20 years. I've killed for you. Bled for you. Watched you become something that terrifies half the realm, and I never flinched. If I wanted you dead, I've had 1,000 better opportunities than hiring incompetent bandits. That's what makes this so effective, Kadrick replied. It's not about killing me. It's about destroying my ability to trust anyone, and it's working. The silence that followed was absolute. Finally, Marcus said, Then you've already decided I'm guilty. No, but I can't afford to be wrong. So what happens now? You execute me on suspicion, lock me in the dungeons until you're satisfied, spend the rest of your life wondering if everyone around you is secretly working against you? Kadrick turned to face his captain. I need proof. One way or the other, there is no proof. That's the point. Whoever set this up made sure of it. Marcus moved closer, his voice dropping. Your Grace, you taught me that power requires ruthlessness, that mercy is weakness, that survival means eliminating threats before they can destroy you. So if you genuinely believe I'm a threat, kill me now. Don't torture yourself with doubt. And if you're innocent, then you'll have murdered the only person in this fortress who's never lied to you. Marcus met his eyes. Your choice. The words hung between them like a blade. Kadrick felt the weight of 20 years pressing down on this single moment. Every battle they'd fought together, every conspiracy they'd dismantled, every impossible situation they'd survived through trust that had never been spoken aloud but had always been absolute. Get out, Kadrick said quietly. Your Grace. Get out before I do something we'll both regret. Marcus held his gaze for another heartbeat, then turned and left. The door closed with a sound like finality. Alone in his study, Kadrick felt the carefully constructed foundations of his world beginning to crack. Power built on fear was stable because fear was predictable, but power that required trust was fragile because trust could be betrayed. And betrayal from someone you'd allowed close was a wound that never truly healed. He didn't know if Marcus was guilty. That was the poison in the trap. Not knowing. The uncertainty that would corrode every decision, every order, every moment of vulnerability. Someone had found the perfect weapon to destroy him, his own paranoia. The second letter arrived 2 days later. This time, it was delivered by a child, paid a copper to leave it at the gate. No description of who'd hired her. The message was shorter than the first. Ask your wife about her meetings with Lord Theron. Ask her what she promised him. Kadrick stood in the courtyard holding the paper, feeling something fundamental shift in his chest. Not Marcus. Seraphine. The 2 people he'd allowed past his defenses. The 2 people whose betrayal would actually destroy him. He found her in their chambers, reviewing reports from the northern estates. She looked up when he entered, her expression shifting immediately to concern. What happened? He handed her the letter without speaking. Seraphine read it once, then crumpled the paper in her fist. This is exactly what I warned you about. Someone systematically turning you against everyone you trust. Are you meeting with Theron? Her eyes flashed. You're seriously asking me that? Answer the question. No. I'm not meeting with anyone without your knowledge. And the fact that you think I might be tells me this poison is working exactly as intended. Kadrick wanted to believe her, wanted to dismiss the letter as another manipulation. But doubt had already taken root, spreading through his thoughts like infection through a wound. Theron was bankrupt and desperate. Seraphine had political skills that would be valuable to someone trying to rebuild power. The connection made sense. Prove it, he said. Prove I'm not betraying you? She laughed bitterly. How exactly do I prove a negative? Should I account for every hour of my day? Provide witnesses for every conversation? At what point does your paranoia stop being protection and start being insanity? When I'm satisfied you're telling the truth, And how do I satisfy you, Kaedric? What test can I possibly pass when you've already decided I'm guilty? I haven't decided anything. Yes, you have. Seraphine stood, her composure finally cracking. You decided the moment you read that letter. Just like you decided Marcus was guilty the moment someone suggested it. You've spent so long protecting yourself from betrayal that you can't recognize loyalty even when it's standing right in front of you. Loyalty is a fantasy, Kedrick said. Everyone has a breaking point. Everyone has a price. Is that what you really believe? It's what I know. I've watched it happen too many times. Then you've already lost, she said quietly. Because if you can't trust anyone, you're not building an empire. You're building a tomb. And eventually you'll be the only one left inside it. She walked past him toward the door, and Kaedrick felt something desperate claw at his chest. Wait. Seraphine paused without turning. Why? So you can interrogate me some more? Question my loyalty? Treat me like another potential threat? So I can figure out who's doing this before they succeed in destroying everything. She turned to face him, and he saw something in her expression that looked like grief. They've already succeeded, Kaedrick. You just haven't realized it yet. The door closed behind her, leaving him alone with the crumpled letter and the growing certainty that he was losing control of something far more important than territory or power. The third letter arrived at midnight, delivered by an arrow through the window of his study. This one was different. Longer. More detailed. Duke Dravenmore. By now you've received proof of betrayals from your captain and your wife. You're questioning everyone, trusting no one. Good. That's exactly where we need you. Tomorrow at dawn, Lord Theron will arrive at Ravenscar's gates under a flag of truce. He's bringing evidence of a conspiracy that reaches into your own household. You can choose to believe him or kill him. Either way, you lose. Because the real betrayer is someone you haven't suspected yet. Someone who's been with you from the beginning. Sleep well, Duke. What's left of your empire ends tomorrow. Kedrick read the letter 3 times, searching for the trap. Theron arriving under truce. Evidence of conspiracy. Someone from the beginning. The phrasing was deliberate, designed to make him second-guess everyone. Marcus had been with him from the beginning. So had a dozen other advisors and guards. The net could spread infinitely if he let paranoia drive his thinking. But there was something else, something the letter writer had revealed without meaning to. They knew he'd be in his study at midnight, knew which window to shoot the arrow through, knew he'd be alone. That information narrowed the field considerably. Kedrick spent the rest of the night reviewing guard rotations, access logs, anyone who would have known his location and habits. The list was short. Marcus. Seraphine. His personal steward. 3 guards who rotated duty outside the study. One of them was the source. Dawn arrived gray and cold, the kind of morning that felt like an ending. Kedrick stood on the battlements watching Lord Theron's procession approach. A small retinue, white banner flying, the older noble himself riding at the front looking diminished and desperate. Marcus appeared at his elbow. Your Grace, this could be a trap. Everything's a trap, Kedrick replied. The question is whether springing it reveals the trapper. You're going to meet with him? I'm going to hear what he has to say, and you're going to watch my back. If I'm the betrayer, that's a mistake. If you're the betrayer, you'll make a move eventually. Better to keep you close where I can see it coming. Marcus nodded slowly. As you command. They met Theron in the great hall, the space still showing signs of reconstruction from the siege. The older noble looked like he'd aged 10 years in 6 months, his hair completely white now, his face carved with lines of stress and failure. Duke Dravenmore, he said formally, thank you for receiving me. Save the pleasantries, Kedrick replied. You have something to tell me. Tell it. Theron glanced at Marcus, then back to Kedrick. Perhaps we should speak privately. Nothing you say leaves this room anyway. Marcus stays. The older noble sighed. Very well. I've been approached by someone claiming to represent a faction within your own household. They offered to restore my fortunes if I provided testimony against you. Evidence of tyranny, corruption, the usual accusations. And you refused? I accepted. Theron's expression was bitter. I was desperate. Bankrupt. They offered me everything I'd lost. All I had to do was sign statements accusing you of crimes I knew you didn't commit. Why are you telling me this? Because when I met with them to finalize the arrangement, I recognize someone. Someone who shouldn't have been there. Who? Theron pulled a document from his coat. A signed confession. Names, dates, details of the conspiracy. He placed it on the table between them. Your wife's handwriting is distinctive, he said quietly. I've seen enough of her correspondence to recognize it. The words hit Kaedric like a physical blow. He picked up the document, seeing Seraphine's elegant script outlining a plan to discredit him, turn his allies against him, and ultimately claim Ravenscar for herself. Dates matched the letters he'd received. Details aligned with information only someone in his inner circle would know. This is a forgery, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I thought so too, Theron replied, until I saw her meeting with the intermediaries myself. 3 nights ago in the capital. She was coordinating the final stages of the plan. Kaedric felt the floor drop out from beneath him. 3 nights ago, Seraphine had claimed to be reviewing estate reports in their chambers. She'd been there when he'd fallen asleep. He'd assumed she'd stayed there all night. You're lying, he said. I wish I was. Theron's expression held genuine regret. Your Grace, I know what you're thinking, that this is revenge for what you did to me. But I'm here because someone played us both for fools. They used my desperation and your paranoia to tear apart everything you built. And they did it using the one person you never suspected. Marcus was silent, his hand resting on his sword hilt, watching Kaedric's reaction. Where is she now? Kaedric asked. The capital. Meeting with representatives from the Crown. Building support for a formal investigation into your activities. The timing was perfect. Too perfect. Kaedric had spent days suspecting Marcus, questioning Seraphine, tearing his household apart from the inside. And while he'd been focused on internal threats, his wife had been in the Capitol building the case that would destroy him. Unless this was exactly what someone wanted him to think. Your Grace, Marcus said quietly, we need to verify this before you do something irreversible. Irreversible, Kaedric repeated. Like trusting the wrong person? Like believing loyalty exists? Like executing your wife based on testimony from a man who admitted he was paid to lie about you? The logic cut through Kaedric's rage like cold water. Marcus was right. Theron had just confessed to being a professional liar. Using his evidence to condemn Seraphine was insane, but the handwriting was real. The dates were accurate. The details were too specific to be fabrication. I need to see her, Kaedric said. Now. She's not due back for 3 days, Theron said. But if you move quickly, you can intercept her at the crossroads, confront her before she reaches the capital's protection. Or walk into an ambush, Marcus added. Your Grace, this entire situation screams trap. Then what do you suggest? Verify everything. Send scouts to the capital. Confirm Seraphine's actually there. Check the handwriting against known samples. Build actual evidence before making decisions that can't be unmade. Kaedric looked at his captain, seeing the same steady pragmatism that had guided them through 2 decades of survival. Marcus was right. Moving on emotion was how men got killed, but standing still while betrayal metastasized was how empires fell. Prepare a fast group, Kaedric ordered. We ride for the crossroads in 1 hour. If Seraphine's there, we'll have answers. If she's not, we'll know Theron's lying. And if it's an ambush? Marcus asked. Then we fight our way through it. Same as always. Quat. The ride to the crossroads took half a day of hard travel. Kaedric pushed the horses harder than was safe, driven by a desperation that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the growing certainty that his world was collapsing. They reached the crossroads at sunset, the dying light painting everything in shades of blood and shadow. At first, Kaedric thought they'd arrived too early or too late. The road was empty in both directions. Then he saw the bodies. 6 men, all wearing Ravenscar's colors, all dead from arrows and blade work. Professional kills, clean, efficient. Marcus dismounted, examining the corpses. These are from the patrol I sent ahead to scout. They were supposed to report back 2 hours ago. Kaedric felt ice spread through his veins. Who knew about the patrol? Just us. And Theron, which meant either Theron had betrayed them or someone was watching their movements closely enough to intercept the scouts before they could report. A trap, Marcus said. We need to leave. Now. Too late. The voice came from the tree line. Kaedric turned to see Seraphine step into the road, flanked by 20 armed men. She wasn't dressed for travel. She was dressed for war. Leather armor, weapons visible, her expression cold and empty. "Hello, husband," she said. Kedrick's hand moved to his sword, but Marcus grabbed his arm. "Your Grace, look at the positions. We're surrounded." He was right. More figures emerged from the trees, 50 men total, maybe more, all armed, all positioned to cut off any escape. Seraphine walked closer, stopping just outside sword range. "You came." "I wasn't sure you would." "The documents were real," Kedrick said. "You've been planning this." "Since the day I walked into Ravenscar," she replied. "Did you really think I married you for protection? That I needed the great Duke Dravenmore to save me from my family's debts? Then why?" "Because you were the biggest threat to my actual plans." She gestured at the armed men surrounding them. "These are what's left of the noble houses you destroyed. Ashcroft, Valdris, Castell. All the families you broke. I brought them together, united them against you. By marrying me. By getting close enough to learn every weakness, every secret, every piece of leverage I needed to tear apart your empire from the inside." Kedrick felt something fundamental break in his chest. The siege, the letters, the paranoia about Marcus. All of it had been Seraphine's work, not trying to destroy his trust in others, trying to isolate him completely so when the final blow came, he'd have nobody left to turn to. Marcus was reaching for his sword, but Kedrick stopped him. "Wait." He looked at Seraphine, really looked at her, and saw something that didn't fit the narrative she was presenting. Her hands were shaking, almost imperceptibly, but enough. "You're lying," he said. "Excuse me?" "If this was your plan all along, why wait 6 months after Ravenscar was rebuilt? Why not strike while I was weak? Why help me regain power if you just wanted to destroy me?" Seraphine's expression flickered. "Because I needed you strong enough that breaking you would actually matter." "No." Kedrick stepped closer despite Marcus's warning. "You needed time because this isn't your plan. Someone's forcing you to do this." The archers in the trees adjusted their aim, arrows now pointed directly at Kedrick's chest. "Don't move," Seraphine said, and for the first time her voice wavered. "Who's holding leverage over you? What did they threaten?" "Nothing. I'm here because I choose to be. Then prove it. Kill me yourself." He drew his sword and tossed it at her feet. The blade landed between them, steel ringing against stone. "If this is truly about revenge, do it personally. Look me in the eyes while you end this." Seraphine stared at the sword, and Kedrick saw the internal war happening behind her eyes. Whatever she'd been told to do, whatever pressure had been applied, it was fracturing under the reality of following through. "Pick up the sword, Seraphine," Kedrick said quietly. "Or tell me who's really pulling the strings." A new voice cut through the tension. "She can't tell you because I've made it quite clear what happens if she does." A figure stepped from the tree line, and Kedrick's world inverted completely. "Marcus," he said, "the real Marcus. The one who'd been with him from the beginning." The captain smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Surprised, Your Grace?" "You shouldn't be. I've been planning this for longer than she has." The man standing beside Kedrick, the one he'd thought was Marcus, suddenly moved, blade finding its way to Kedrick's throat before he could react. "You've been riding with my brother for the past 3 months, the real Marcus said from the tree line. "Twin brothers. Convenient, isn't it? One plays loyal captain while the other learns everything you never told me. Every weakness, every fear, every secret you kept hidden." Kedrick felt the blade press against his throat, felt his own stupidity crushing down like physical weight. The letters, the paranoia, the test with the bandits. All of it had been designed to make him question everyone except the one person who'd been betraying him all along. "Why?" he asked. "Because 20 years ago you had my father executed for treason," Marcus replied. "Lord Varon Ashcroft, the man whose children you murdered in the dungeons. One of those children was mine, a nephew I never got to meet because you decided bloodlines were threats." Kedrick remembered the execution, remembered the children, remembered making the decision that had felt necessary at the time. So all of this, the siege, the rebuilding, standing beside me. All of it was revenge? All of it was patience, Marcus corrected. waiting for you to trust me enough that betraying you would actually hurt. And it does hurt, doesn't it? Knowing the one person you relied on was the architect of your destruction. The fake Marcus, the brother, tightened his grip. Your Grace, any final words before we finish this? Cedric looked at Seraphine, saw tears streaming down her face, saw the gun pointed at her from the shadows. She'd been trapped just like him, forced to participate in his destruction or watch someone she cared about die. The irony was almost beautiful. He'd spent his entire life building walls against betrayal, and the betrayal that finally destroyed him had come from the man standing inside those walls all along. You were right, he said to Seraphine. Connection makes you vulnerable. Love makes you weak. I should have listened. Before anyone could respond, Cedric moved. Not to escape, there was no escape, but to buy time. He drove his elbow into the fake Marcus's ribs, twisted free from the blade, grabbed Seraphine and pulled her down as arrows filled the space where they'd been standing. The crossroads exploded into chaos. The first arrow caught the fake Marcus in the throat. He went down choking, blood spraying across Cedric's face as the Duke rolled with Seraphine into the cover of a fallen tree. Chaos erupted around them, 50 armed men suddenly firing at each other in the confusion, nobody certain who was attacking whom. Cedric had maybe 10 seconds before they sorted out the friendly fire situation and refocused on the actual targets. He grabbed Seraphine's face, forcing her to meet his eyes. Who's holding leverage over you? My sister, she gasped. They have Elena. Said they'd kill her if I didn't. Where? Ravenscar. The dungeons. Marcus has her locked in the same cell where you killed the Ashcroft children. The irony would have been poetic if it wasn't so vicious. Cedric's past crimes becoming the prison for the one person Seraphine cared about enough to betray him. Marcus had orchestrated this perfectly, using guilt and love as weapons far sharper than any blade. An arrow slammed into the tree above their heads, showering them with splinters. The archers had their range now. In 30 seconds, this cover would be useless. Can you fight? Cedric demanded. Seraphine pulled a knife from her boot. Give me a target. He looked around the crossroads, calculating odds that made professional gamblers look optimistic. 50 enemies. 2 of them. No horses, no backup. The only advantage they had was that Marcus wanted this drawn out, wanted Cedric to feel the betrayal, savor the destruction. That theatrical cruelty bought them maybe 5 minutes before overwhelming force ended this permanently. 5 minutes to do something impossible. Cedric pulled Seraphine up and they ran, not away from the ambush, but directly through it, using the chaos as cover. Men scrambled to adjust positions. Arrows flew wild. Someone shouted orders that got lost in the din. The Duke moved like violence incarnate, his stolen blade finding throats and hearts with the brutal efficiency of someone who'd spent decades learning where bodies broke easiest. Seraphine fought beside him with desperate ferocity, her knife work less skilled but compensating with pure survival instinct. They carved a path through the first line of attackers, leaving bodies in their wake, moving too fast for the archers to target effectively. Then they hit the tree line and real Marcus was waiting. The captain moved with the same combat precision Cedric had trained him in, his blade intercepting the Duke's attack with perfect form. They'd sparred together for 20 years. Marcus knew every technique, every tell, every pattern in Cedric's fighting style. It was like fighting a mirror that wanted him dead. You trained me too well, Marcus said, their blades locked together. Every weakness I know because you showed me how to exploit it. Cedric drove a knee into Marcus's ribs, creating separation. Then I also taught you that training only matters when both fighters want to survive. He attacked with the kind of reckless aggression that violated every principle he'd ever preached. No defense, no caution, just pure offense designed to overwhelm through sheer brutal momentum. Marcus gave ground, his expression shifting from confidence to concern as he realized what Cedric had become in the span of 30 seconds. A man with nothing left to lose was the most dangerous opponent in the world because he'd already accepted death. The only question was how many people he could take with him. Their blades met in combinations that would have killed lesser fighters 10 times over. Blood flowed. Cedric couldn't tell whose anymore. His vision narrowed to Marcus's eyes, seeing the same cold calculation he'd relied on for 2 decades now turned against him. This was what he'd created. what he'd shaped through years of brutal pragmatism. The perfect weapon, finally pointed at his own throat. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it clarified something fundamental. Power built on fear and control was inherently unstable because eventually someone learned the system well enough to use it against you. Marcus hadn't invented some revolutionary strategy. He'd just applied Kaedric's own philosophy more ruthlessly than Kaedric had imagined possible, which meant the only way to win was to abandon the philosophy entirely. Kaedric stopped defending. Just stopped, left himself completely open, and drove his blade toward Marcus's heart with both hands, accepting that the counterattack would probably kill him, but betting everything on speed and commitment. Marcus hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. The ingrained training to defend himself overriding the tactical advantage of trading kills. That hesitation cost him. Kaedric's blade punched through leather armor and into flesh. Not deep enough to be immediately fatal, but enough to wound. Enough to slow him, enough to buy the second Seraphine needed to slam her knife into Marcus's kidney from behind. The captain went down hard, blood pooling beneath him. His eyes found Kaedric's, showing something that might have been respect or might have been hatred. Probably both. "You should have killed me 20 years ago," Marcus whispered. "First day we met. Should have seen the threat." "You're right," Kaedric said. "That's on me." He drove his blade through Marcus's heart, ending it quickly. No torture, no speeches, just the brutal efficiency of a man who understood that mercy and cruelty were sometimes the same thing. Seraphine pulled her knife free, her hands shaking. "We need to move. The others are regrouping," Kaedric finished, "and we're not going to outrun them. Then what? We go back to Ravenscar. Get your sister. End this." She stared at him. "That's insane. Marcus's forces control the fortress. We'd be walking into a siege with 2 people. You have a better plan?" Seraphine looked at the approaching soldiers, at Marcus's body, at the impossible mathematics of their survival. No, I don't." "Then we run." They stole horses from the dead and rode hard for Ravenscar, pushing the animals past their limits. Behind them, pursuit organized itself with military efficiency. Marcus's second-in-command taking control, sending fast riders ahead to warn the fortress, positioning forces to cut off escape routes. Kaedric knew they wouldn't make it to Ravenscar before the warning arrived, knew the gates would be sealed, defenses activated, every advantage turned against them. But speed wasn't about reaching the fortress first. It was about forcing his enemies to react faster than they could plan, creating chaos that might buy them the opening they needed. Seraphine rode beside him, her face grim. "How many men does Marcus have in Ravenscar?" 100. Maybe more if he's been recruiting. Against the 2 of us. Against whatever we can scrape together, Kaedric corrected. There are still loyalists in the fortress. People who served me before Marcus revealed himself. We find them, activate them, turn this into a civil war inside the walls. And if there aren't any loyalists left, then we die trying to save your sister." He looked at her directly. "I'm not leaving Elena in those dungeons. Why? After everything I did? Because you did it to protect someone you love." Kaedric's voice was harsh but honest. "That's the only betrayal that actually makes sense. If you'd sold me out for power or revenge, I'd have killed you myself. But this I understand." The admission hung between them as they rode through darkness. Somewhere in the past 6 months, Kaedric had stopped seeing Seraphine as a strategic asset and started seeing her as the one person whose survival mattered more than his own pride. That transformation terrified him more than any army because it represented the exact vulnerability his father had died from. But standing at the crossroads with arrows raining down, watching Seraphine fight beside him despite being trapped in an impossible situation, Kaedric had realized something his father never understood. Vulnerability wasn't weakness if you weaponized it. Loving someone didn't make you controllable if you were willing to burn down the world to protect them. Marcus had tried to use connection as a trap. Instead, he'd created something far more dangerous, a man who'd already lost everything except one person, which made that person worth more than kingdoms. They reached Ravenscar 3 hours before dawn. The fortress loomed against the night sky exactly as Kaedric remembered. Black marble walls, towering battlements, the ancestral seat of House Dravenmore standing like a monument to power built on blood and fear. Torches blazed along the walls, Guards moved in organized patrols. The gates were sealed tight. Marcus's second-in-command had made good time with the warning. The fortress was locked down. Seraphine stared at the walls. "How do we get inside?" Kadric smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. The same way I got out when I was 15 and my father locked me in my chambers for insubordination. "There's a secret entrance?" "3 of them. My father built escape routes in case the nobility ever turned against him." He pulled out the map he'd been carrying, showing tunnels that connected to the river, the forest, and the old crypt beneath the chapel. "Marcus knows about 2 of them. But the 3rd? "You never told him." "I never told anyone. It was insurance." Kadric folded the map. "We use the crypt entrance, come up through the dungeons, find Elena and as many loyalists as we can before Marcus's people realize we're inside. And then we take back my fortress, one bloody corridor at a time." The crypt entrance was hidden beneath a collapsed section of the old chapel, accessible only by moving a specific stone in a specific sequence. Kadric worked the mechanism from memory, muscles remembering movements he hadn't performed in decades. The stone shifted. A gap appeared. Darkness exhaled like breath from a tomb. They descended into tunnels that smelled like centuries of decay and groundwater. Kadric led the way with a torch, navigating by instinct through passages that branched and twisted. These tunnels had been built during the first Dravenmoor Duke's reign, designed as escape routes during the wars that forged the North. Walking through them now felt like traveling through his family's violent history. Every duke who'd ruled from Ravenscar had added something to these passages. His great-grandfather had installed the false walls. His grandfather had created the flooding mechanisms. His father had mapped the connections to the city's underground, and Kadric had used them exactly once, to escape punishment and prove to his father that walls only kept out people who didn't know where the cracks were. The irony of using those same tunnels to break into his own fortress wasn't lost on him. They emerged in the dungeons through a cell that appeared to be solid stone, until you knew which brick to press. The dungeons were quiet, too quiet. Guards should have been making rounds. Prisoners should have been making noise. The silence felt wrong. Kadric moved through the familiar corridors with blade drawn, checking cells systematically. Most were empty. A few contained bodies, loyalists, based on the House Dravenmoor insignias they wore. Marcus had been efficient in purging anyone who might resist his takeover. Then they found Elena. She was in the cell Kadric remembered, the one where he'd ordered the Ashcroft children executed 20 years ago. She looked like a younger version of Seraphine, same dark hair and sharp features, but where Seraphine had learned to hide her fear behind composure, Elena wore her terror openly. She was chained to the wall, bruised and bloodied, but alive. Seraphine ran to her sister, working at the chains. "Elena, it's me. I'm here." The girl's eyes focused slowly. "Sarah? They said you'd—" "I know what they said." Seraphine got the first chain free. "We're getting you out." Kadric kept watch at the cell door, listening for movement in the corridors. This was too easy. Marcus's people should have posted guards, should have anticipated this exact scenario. The fact that the dungeons were nearly empty suggested either incompetence or trap. Given Marcus's planning so far, incompetence seemed unlikely. "We need to move," he said. "Now." But Seraphine was struggling with the second chain, the lock more complex than the first. Elena was crying, asking questions that had no good answers. Time dilated in that terrible way it did before violence erupted, everything simultaneously too fast and too slow. Then Kadric heard footsteps, multiple sets, coming from both directions. He'd been right. It was a trap. "Get her free," he ordered, moving to block the cell entrance. "Whatever it takes." The first guards appeared at the corridor's end. 6 men, fully armored, moving with professional coordination. They saw Kadric and stopped, weapons drawn, but not immediately attacking. Then a voice called out from behind them. "Hold positions. I want to talk to him first." A figure pushed through the guards. Not one of Marcus's soldiers, but someone Kadric recognized from the council meetings before Ravenscar fell. Lord Gareth, Marcus's lieutenant, who'd provided the alibi about perimeter checks. The man who'd been positioned to verify Marcus's loyalty while actually covering for his betrayal. Your Grace, Gareth said with mocking formality. You're persistent. I'll give you that. Where's Marcus? Dead. Killed him at the crossroads. Gareth's expression didn't change. Unfortunate. He was supposed to see this through to the end, but his brother can finish the job just as well. The fake Marcus was dead too. Gareth smiled. You really think Marcus only had one brother? House Ashcroft was a large family before you murdered them. There are 3 more brothers, all trained, all committed, all waiting for you to get close enough to one of them before revealing themselves. The words landed like physical blows. Caedric had killed one Marcus, but there were replacements. People who looked identical, knew the same information, could slip into the role seamlessly. He'd been fighting shadows of the same enemy without realizing it. This entire conspiracy had been built with redundancy. Kill one coordinator and another stepped up. Expose one agent and another remained hidden. Marcus had designed this to survive his own death because the revenge wasn't about him personally. It was about making Caedric understand what it felt like to have everything taken away piece by piece. How many others? Caedric demanded. How many people in my own fortress have been replaced? Enough, Gareth said. Your steward, your food taster, 3 of your personal guards. We've been inside your walls for months, Your Grace, learning your routines, mapping your defenses, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And that moment is now. Actually, the moment was supposed to be after you'd been completely isolated, after you'd executed Seraphine for treason and spent weeks spiraling into paranoid madness. Gareth shrugged. But you proved more resilient than expected. So we're accelerating the timeline. He gestured, and the guards advanced. Caedric met them in the narrow corridor where numbers meant less than skill. His blade moved in patterns burned into muscle memory through decades of combat, finding gaps in armor, exploiting momentary imbalances. These weren't Marcus-level fighters. They were good, but good wasn't enough against someone who'd built an empire through personal violence. He killed the first 2 in as many seconds. The third lost his sword arm. The fourth took a blade through the eye socket. The remaining guards hesitated, suddenly aware they were fighting something that didn't respect the normal rules of combat. Behind him, Caedric heard chains break. Seraphine had gotten Elena free. One objective accomplished. Now they just needed to survive long enough to escape. Gareth watched the bodies pile up with detached interest. Impressive, but ultimately futile. We control this fortress, Your Grace. Every exit is sealed. Every tunnel is watched. You can kill everyone I send at you and you'll still die here. Then I'll die taking as many of you bastards with me as I can, Caedric replied. He advanced on Gareth, but more guards appeared, 12 this time, flooding the corridor from both directions. Too many to fight simultaneously in close quarters. The mathematics had turned impossible. Seraphine appeared beside him with Elena supported between her and the wall. We can't fight through this. No, Caedric agreed, but we can make them regret trying. He grabbed a torch from the wall and threw it into the cell behind them. The cell where oil lamps had been burning for illumination, where straw covered the floor, where decades of accumulated debris created perfect kindling. The flames caught immediately, spreading faster than anyone expected. The dungeons of Ravenscar had been built during a time when people didn't worry much about fire safety. Stone walls meant flames couldn't spread horizontally, but smoke had nowhere to go except up through ventilation shafts and along corridors. Within seconds, the air became thick and poisonous. Gareth stumbled backward, coughing. You're insane. You'll kill yourself. Already dead anyway, Caedric said. This just makes it warmer. He grabbed Seraphine and Elena, pulling them deeper into the smoke-filled dungeons, using the chaos to disappear into corridors that most people didn't know existed. Behind them, guards shouted conflicting orders, some trying to fight the fire, others trying to pursue through conditions that made vision impossible. Caedric navigated by memory and touch, leading them through passages that connected to the lower armory, then to storage chambers, then finally to a stairwell that climbed toward Ravenscar's main levels. His lungs burned. His eyes streamed tears. Elena had stopped moving on her own, dead weight supported between him and Seraphine. But they were still alive, still moving, still fighting. They emerged from the stairwell into chaos. The fire had spread faster than expected, smoke pouring through ventilation systems, guards running in every direction, normal fortress operations collapsing into disaster management. Nobody noticed two soot-covered figures carrying a third through corridors that should have been secure. Kadric led them to his private chambers, the rooms that had been his sanctuary before Marcus's betrayal. The doors were locked, but not sealed. Inside, everything looked exactly as he'd left it. Maps still spread on the desk, armor still hanging on stands, personal items untouched. It felt like walking into his own tomb. He laid Elena on the bed while Seraphine checked her sister's breathing. The girl was unconscious, but alive. Smoke inhalation and exhaustion, not fatal injuries. "She needs a healer," Seraphine said. "We all need things we're not going to get," Kadric replied, moving to the weapons cabinet. He pulled out his personal armory, blades he'd collected over 20 years, each one a memory of battles survived and enemies destroyed. He strapped them on methodically, transforming from desperate fugitive back into the Duke of Ravenscar. "What's the plan?" Seraphine demanded. "The plan is we end this. Tonight. No more running. No more tactical retreats. We find whoever's coordinating Marcus's network, and we kill them. Cut off the head, and the body dies. And if there isn't just one coordinator, if it's distributed command like everything else they've done, then we kill everyone until there's nobody left to coordinate." The answer was simple and brutal and completely honest. Kadric had spent months trying to outmaneuver his enemies, playing political games, attempting to rebuild power through traditional means. All of it had been wasted effort because Marcus had already infiltrated every system, corrupted every structure, turned the fortress itself into a weapon aimed at its own master. The only solution was to burn it all down and rebuild from ashes, again. Seraphine was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You understand this makes you exactly what they claimed you were, a tyrant willing to destroy everything rather than surrender power." "I never claimed to be anything else," Kadric said. "The difference is I'm honest about it." He moved to the chamber window, looking out at Ravenscar's courtyard where guards were fighting fires and coordinating search parties. The fortress was in controlled chaos, dangerous but not yet catastrophic. If he moved fast, if he struck before they could regroup, he might be able to decapitate the conspiracy before it fully activated. It was a terrible plan with minimal chances of success, but terrible plans were all he had left. A knock at the door froze both of them, soft, deliberate. 3 precise raps, the pattern Marcus used to announce himself. Kadric drew his blade and moved to the side of the door, gesturing for Seraphine to stay back with Elena. He waited. 5 seconds. 10. Then the door opened slowly, revealing a figure in guard's armor. Not Marcus, but wearing Marcus's face. Another brother, the third or fourth or however many replacements this conspiracy had prepared. The man stepped into the chamber with hands raised, showing no weapons. "Your Grace, I'm not here to fight." "Then why are you here?" "To offer terms." Kadric laughed. It was a harsh, empty sound. "Terms. From the people trying to kill me." The Marcus copy remained calm. "Our objective was never to kill you. It was to break you. Make you understand what it feels like to lose everything. That's been accomplished. So now we're willing to negotiate." "Negotiate what?" "Your life in exchange for Elena's. You surrender. Face trial for your crimes. Accept whatever punishment the new council decides. And your wife's sister goes free." Seraphine made a sound of protest, but Kadric raised a hand to silence her. "What happens to Seraphine? She stands trial as well, but will show mercy given that she was coerced into cooperation." "How generous." "It's a fair offer," the Marcus copy said. "You get to live. They get to live. The bloodshed ends. Ravenscar stops burning." Kadric studied the man wearing his former captain's face, seeing the same calculated pragmatism Marcus had always displayed. This wasn't a bluff. They genuinely believed offering terms was the smart move. Let Kadric surrender peacefully rather than fighting to the death and potentially taking dozens more people with him. The offer made strategic sense. It was exactly what Kadric himself would propose if their positions were reversed, which was why he knew it was bullshit. "No trial happens," he said quietly. "I surrender and I disappear into a dungeon cell where accidents happen. Seraphine and Elena have tragic accidents of their own. The new council consolidates power without witnesses who can challenge their narrative. That's paranoid speculation. It's what I'd do. The Marcus copy's expression shifted slightly. Then you understand we're offering you the best outcome available. Death with dignity rather than death fighting guards in corridors. Kadric moved faster than the man could react, his blade finding the gap in armor beneath the ribs. Not a killing strike, but close. The Marcus copy gasped, blood spreading across his uniform. "Tell your masters I'm not interested in their terms," Kadric said. "Tell them I'm coming for them. And tell them that every person who stands between me and the people who orchestrated this conspiracy will die screaming." He pulled the blade free and let the man stumble backward into the corridor, clutching the wound. The message would spread. The conspiracy would know negotiations had failed. They'd come at him with everything, exactly what he wanted. Seraphine grabbed his arm. "That was our chance to save Elena without more fighting. That was their chance to control how this ends," Kadric corrected. "I'm not giving them that satisfaction. So we fight. We fight." He checked his weapons one final time, seeing Seraphine do the same. Elena was still unconscious on the bed, oblivious to the violence about to erupt around her. In a different world, Kadric would have found a way to get them both out, sacrificed himself as distraction, died heroically so they could escape. But heroes were just dead men who'd failed to survive. And survival required choices that made heroism look like cowardice. They barricaded the chamber doors with furniture and prepared for siege. Outside, alarm bells rang through Ravenscar. Guards mobilized. The fortress transformed from chaotic to militarized in the span of minutes. Somewhere in those corridors, commanders were organizing forces, planning the assault that would end this permanently. Kadric listened to the preparations and felt something settle in his chest. Not peace exactly, more like acceptance of what came next. He'd built an empire on fear and control. That empire had been corrupted from within by the same methods he'd used to create it. Now he was going to tear it all down and build something new from the wreckage. Or die trying. Seraphine stood beside him at the window, both of them watching fires spread across Ravenscar's lower levels. "How did we get here?" she asked quietly. "We trusted the wrong people." "No." She turned to face him. "We trusted the right person. We just didn't realize he'd been destroyed by the same man we were trying to protect ourselves from." Kadric understood what she meant. Marcus had been loyal once, before Kadric executed his family, before 20 years of resentment calcified into hatred. The captain who'd stood beside him through countless battles had been real. But that person had died in the dungeons where the Ashcroft children were murdered, replaced by something that wore loyalty like camouflage while plotting revenge. The tragedy wasn't that Marcus had betrayed him, it was that Kadric had created the betrayer through his own brutality. "Do you regret it?" Seraphine asked. "Any of it?" "Every day," Kadric said. "But regret changes nothing." The first assault hit 30 seconds later. Guards with battering rams smashed through the barricaded door, pouring into the chamber in coordinated waves. Kadric met them with the kind of violence that defined his entire existence. Calculated, brutal, absolutely merciless. These were his own men, people he'd trained, people who'd sworn oaths to House Dravenmore. He killed them anyway, because mercy was a luxury reserved for people who hadn't lost everything. And Kadric had nothing left except the woman fighting beside him and the unconscious girl they were both trying to protect. The chamber became a slaughterhouse. Bodies piled at the doorway, blood soaked into expensive carpets. Kadric fought with mechanical precision, conserving energy, targeting kill shots, making every movement count. Seraphine covered his blind spots with desperate efficiency, her knife work improving with each exchange. They were going to lose. The mathematics were impossible, but they'd make it cost everything. Then something changed. Guards in the corridor started fighting each other. Kadric caught glimpses through the doorway, House Dravenmore loyalists attacking Marcus's infiltrators, civil war erupting in the passages beyond his chamber. Someone had activated resistance cells. Someone had turned the conspiracy's infiltration tactics against itself. A new voice shouted commands in the corridor. Not Gareth. Not any Marcus copy. Someone Kadric recognized from before the betrayal. Lieutenant Aldrich, one of his oldest officers. Someone he'd assumed was dead or compromised. Your Grace, Aldrich called through the doorway. We're clearing the corridor. Hold position. The fighting intensified. Kedrick heard screams, steel on steel, bodies hitting stone. Then sudden quiet. Aldrich appeared in the doorway, bloodied but alive. Your Grace, we need to move. We've secured the eastern wing, but it won't hold long. How many loyalists? 40, maybe 50. Everyone who survived Marcus's purge and stayed hidden. We've been waiting for a signal. And my return was the signal? Your return was proof you weren't dead. That was enough. Kedrick looked at Seraphine, saw the same desperate hope he felt. This wasn't over. The conspiracy still controlled most of Ravenscar, but they had fighters now, numbers, a chance. He grabbed Elena from the bed, lifting her unconscious weight easily. Where are we falling back to? The old keep, Aldrich said, the tower your father used during the Civil Wars. It's defensible, and we've been stockpiling weapons there for weeks. Lead the way. They moved through corridors transformed into battlegrounds, stepping over bodies of guards who'd been fighting each other minutes ago. Loyalists fell in around them, creating a protective formation. Kedrick saw faces he recognized, soldiers who'd served him for years, who'd hidden their loyalty during Marcus's takeover, who'd waited for exactly this moment to reveal themselves. The conspiracy had been thorough, but Kedrick had been building loyalty for decades, not through fear alone, but through the kind of ruthless competence that made people believe following him was the best chance of survival. Now that loyalty was paying dividends measured in blood and desperation, they reached the old keep as the sun rose over Ravenscar, painting the fortress in shades of fire and ash. Kedrick positioned Elena in the most secure chamber, posted guards, then climbed to the battlements to assess their situation. What he saw made his stomach sink. Marcus's forces controlled 3/4 of the fortress. They'd sealed the gates, positioned siege equipment in the courtyards, prepared for exactly this scenario. Loyalists retreating to the keep, forcing a siege within a siege. Aldrich joined him on the battlements. We have food for maybe 3 days, water for 5 if we ration. After that, we'll be drinking our own piss and eating leather. How many effectives? 42 who can fight. Another dozen wounded. If they assault in force, we'll hold maybe an hour. The mathematics were brutal. But Kedrick had survived on brutal mathematics his entire life. The question wasn't whether they could win a conventional siege. It was whether they could do something unconventional enough to change the equation. He looked at the fortress he'd lost and reclaimed and lost again, seeing it with fresh eyes. Ravenscar had been built during wars that made current conflicts look like border skirmishes. Every wall had secrets. Every tower had vulnerabilities. His ancestors had designed this place to be both fortress and trap, depending on who controlled which sections. Right now, Marcus's forces controlled the main fortress. But Kedrick controlled the keep, and the keep had access to systems the main fortress didn't, the flooding mechanisms. His grandfather had installed them during a siege 2 generations ago, hidden channels that could redirect the river through Ravenscar's foundations, turning the lower levels into death traps. The mechanisms had never been used because flooding your own fortress was insane. But insanity was relative when you were already losing. Kedrick turned to Aldrich. The old river gates. Can we still access them from here? In theory. But Your Grace, if you flood the lower levels while Marcus's people control them, they drown, Kedrick finished. Along with anyone trapped in those sections, loyalists and enemies alike. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. This was the choice. Fight a conventional siege they couldn't win, or commit an atrocity that might give them victory at the cost of everyone in Ravenscar's lower fortress. How many of our people are still trapped down there? Seraphine asked quietly. She'd appeared on the battlements without him noticing. Unknown, Aldrich said. Could be none. Could be dozens. Kedrick looked at her. Your vote? You're asking me if we should murder potentially innocent people to win this fight? I'm asking if you can live with the alternative. She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the fortress spread below them. Then, do it. Whatever it takes to end this. Kedrick gave the orders. Aldrich organized teams to access the mechanisms. Within an hour, they'd cleared the debris blocking the old river gates and prepared the channels for activation. One lever pull, and thousands of gallons of water would flood through Ravenscar's foundations, drowning everyone in the lower dungeons, storage chambers, and connecting corridors. One lever pull and Kaedric would become exactly what his enemies had always claimed, a tyrant willing to murder his own people to maintain power. The realization should have stopped him, should have made him question whether survival at this cost was worth it. Instead, it clarified something he'd been avoiding his entire life. There was no version of victory that didn't require becoming a monster. The only question was whether you owned it or pretended otherwise. He stood in the mechanism chamber with his hand on the lever, listening to water rushing through pipes that hadn't been used in decades. Above him, Ravenscar burned. Around him, loyalists prepared for the final assault. Beside him, Seraphine waited for him to make the choice that would define everything that came after. "Your Grace," Aldrich said, "Marcus's forces are mobilizing. They're going to hit us within the hour. If we're doing this, it needs to be now." Kaedric looked at the lever, looked at Seraphine, looked at the future that hinged on this single decision. Then he heard footsteps behind them. "Wait!" a voice called. He turned to see Elena stumbling into the chamber, supported by one of the guards. The girl looked half dead but conscious, her eyes focusing on the mechanism with horrified understanding. "If you pull that lever," she said, "you flood the dungeons. The dungeons where you're holding prisoners, where Marcus locked people who stayed loyal to you." "We don't know who's down there," Seraphine said gently. "I do," Elena replied. "I was conscious enough to hear guards talking. There are at least 20 people in those cells." "Your people, waiting for rescue." The words hit like physical blows. 20 loyalists, people who'd refused to betray him, people who'd suffered imprisonment rather than switching sides. If he flooded the dungeons, he'd drown them all. But if he didn't, Marcus's assault would overrun the keep, kill everyone here, win permanently. The choice was impossible. Save the people in front of him, or save the people trapped below. Become the monster who murdered his own loyalists, or become the fool who lost everything trying to save them. Kaedric stood frozen, with his hand on the lever, while time compressed to this single terrible moment. Every decision he'd ever made had led here, every brutal choice, every pragmatic sacrifice, every time he'd chosen survival over morality. And now the universe was asking, how far are you actually willing to go? Seraphine touched his arm. "Kaedric, whatever you choose, I'm with you." He looked at her, at Elena, at Aldrich and the loyalists who'd risked everything to fight beside him, at the lever that would decide who lived and who died. Outside, Marcus's forces advanced. Inside, prisoners waited in cells they couldn't escape. Time was gone. The moment had arrived. Kaedric made his choice. Kaedric pulled his hand away from the lever. The decision came not from calculation or strategy, but from something deeper, a fundamental exhaustion with the person he'd become. 20 years of choosing survival over humanity. 20 years of sacrificing everything soft and decent on the altar of pragmatic necessity. And where had it gotten him? Standing in a mechanism chamber debating whether to drown his own loyalists to win a war against enemies he'd created through his own brutality. The cycle had to end, even if ending it meant losing. "We're not flooding the dungeons," he said. Aldrich stared at him. "Your Grace, without that advantage we can't hold the keep. Marcus's forces will overrun us in the first assault. Then we hold as long as we can and we go down fighting. But I'm not drowning people who stayed loyal when betraying me would have been easier." Seraphine touched his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You understand what this means. I understand I've spent my entire life becoming someone I don't recognize, making choices that seemed necessary at the time, but left me hollow." She was right. I was building a tomb. And I'm done laying bricks. He turned to Aldrich. "Send runners to the dungeons. Get those prisoners out through whatever route you can find, even if it compromises our position. Nobody drowns in cells because I was too much of a coward to find another way." The lieutenant hesitated, clearly calculating the tactical implications. Then he saluted and moved to carry out the orders. The other loyalists watched their duke with expressions that ranged from confusion to something approaching respect. They'd followed him because he was ruthless and effective. Now he was choosing principles over victory, and none of them knew how to process it. Kaedric didn't know how to process it himself. This felt like defeat wearing the mask of moral clarity. But standing there with Seraphine and Elena watching him, Feeling the weight of every decision that had led to this moment, he understood that some defeats were actually the only victories that mattered. Power meant nothing if maintaining it required destroying everything worth protecting. The realization should have felt liberating. Instead, it felt like staring into an abyss and accepting he was about to fall in. Marcus's assault hit 20 minutes later. 300 soldiers against 42 defenders in a keep that had been built to withstand armies, but not from enemies already inside the fortress walls. The fighting was immediate and brutal, waves of attackers crashing against barricaded doorways, arrows raining from the battlements, every corridor becoming a kill zone. Kadric fought at the primary breach point, his blade moving in patterns that had defined his entire existence. Kill, move, kill again. Don't think about the mathematics. Don't calculate the inevitable. Just fight until your body gives out or the enemy does. Beside him, loyalists fell. Good men and women who'd chosen to stand with a duke who'd probably led them to their deaths. He learned their names as they died. Lieutenant Merrick taking an arrow through the throat while defending the stairwell. Sergeant Alara cut down by 3 soldiers simultaneously while holding a doorway. Captain Aldrich lasting until the second wave before being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Each death was a weight added to a burden Kadric had been carrying for 2 decades. People who trusted him. People who believed following him meant something beyond survival. People whose loyalty he'd never deserved but had received anyway. The keep's defenses collapsed floor by floor. Kadric pulled his remaining fighters back systematically, trading space for time, making every retreat as costly as possible for the attackers. They abandoned the lower levels, then the middle floors, finally retreating to the tower's highest chambers where Seraphine and Elena waited with a handful of wounded. 12 fighters left. 12 people against an army that had already won but wanted the satisfaction of total victory. Kadric sealed the final door and turned to face his last stand. The chamber was circular, stone walls interrupted by narrow windows that showed Ravenscar burning in the morning light. His fortress, his legacy, everything he'd built turning to ash while he watched from a tower he couldn't defend. The door shuddered under impacts. Battering ram. They weren't even pretending to negotiate anymore. Just pure, overwhelming force designed to end this permanently. Seraphine stood beside him, her armor dented and blood-stained, her expression calm in a way that suggested she'd already accepted what came next. Elena was conscious, but barely, propped against the wall, watching them with eyes that had seen too much suffering. "How do you want to end this?" Seraphine asked quietly. "Honestly," Kadric replied, "no more lies, no more manipulation. Just the truth, which is that I'm sorry for everything, for the person I became, for the choices that led us here, for building an empire on fear and wondering why it collapsed the moment people stopped being afraid. You did what you thought was necessary." "Necessary," he repeated. "That word's been my excuse for 20 years. Every execution, every brutal decision, every time I chose power over humanity, all of it necessary, all of it inevitable, all of it turning me into the exact monster my enemies claimed I was." The door cracked. Splinters flew inward, maybe 30 seconds before it gave completely. "I spent my whole life afraid of becoming my father," Kadric continued, "afraid of showing weakness, afraid that mercy would get me killed. And I was right. Mercy did get me killed, but at least I'll die as something more than the hollow tyrant I'd become." Seraphine kissed him. Brief, desperate, final. "For what it's worth," she said, "I would have chosen you anyway, even knowing how this ends." The door exploded inward. Soldiers poured through the breach, weapons drawn, moving with professional coordination. Kadric raised his blade for the last time, preparing to meet them with whatever strength remained. Then a voice cut through the chaos. "Hold!" The soldiers stopped, confused, weapons still raised but attacks suspended in that terrible moment between violence initiated and violence completed. A figure pushed through the ranks. Not Gareth. Not another Marcus copy. Someone Kadric hadn't seen in the chaos of the past days, but recognized immediately from council meetings before everything collapsed. Lady Morgana Castell. The noblewoman who'd confessed to conspiracy under duress, who'd supposedly been exiled, who Caedric had used as a pawn to rebuild his reputation with the crown. She looked different now, harder, older, carrying herself with the authority of someone who'd claimed power rather than inherited it. "Duke Dravenmore," she said formally, "it's over. Surrender and I'll guarantee your life." "Your guarantees are worth less than the air you waste making them," Caedric replied. "Perhaps, but I'm offering them anyway." She gestured at the soldiers surrounding them. "You've lost. Ravenscar is mine. The Northern Territories acknowledge my authority. The Crown has ratified my claim. Continuing to fight accomplishes nothing except adding bodies to a count that's already too high. Then why offer terms? Because I'm tired of bloodshed. Because Marcus's conspiracy was supposed to bring justice and instead brought chaos. Because somewhere in the past 6 months I realized revenge doesn't actually fix anything. It just creates new cycles of violence." She moved closer, carefully avoiding any gesture that might trigger the nervous soldiers. "You destroyed my reputation," she said. "Forced me to confess to crimes under threat of exposure. Exiled me from court. I had every reason to want you dead. And I did want that. For months I worked with Marcus planning your destruction. But watching it unfold, seeing what it actually cost, I understood something your father tried to teach you, and you never learned. Which is, power built on fear is inherently unstable, but power built on legitimacy, on people actually choosing to follow you, that's sustainable. And right now the North is terrified. They need stability more than they need revenge. So you're offering me what? Exile? Imprisonment? A quick death?" "I'm offering you a choice," Morgana said. "Surrender. Face trial for your crimes. Accept whatever punishment the Council determines. And in exchange, everyone in this chamber walks out alive." Caedric looked at his remaining fighters, exhausted, bloodied, loyal beyond any rational calculation. They'd followed him into impossible situations and somehow survived until the situations became genuinely impossible. "And if I refuse, then we kill everyone here and I spend the rest of my life wondering if there was a better way." The honesty in her voice was unexpected. This wasn't a manipulation or trap. It was genuine exhaustion from someone who'd gotten exactly what she wanted and discovered victory felt hollow. Caedric felt something shift in his understanding. Morgana had won, completely. Taken his fortress, his territories, his authority. She had no tactical reason to offer terms. The only reason that made sense was the one she'd stated. She was tired of bloodshed. Which meant, maybe, possibly, there was a path forward that didn't end with everyone in this chamber dead. What happens to Seraphine and Elena? They go free. No charges. No restrictions. They have my word. Your word, Caedric repeated. The word of someone I forced to destroy her own reputation. Morgana smiled slightly. Which makes it more valuable, doesn't it? I have every reason to lie. The fact that I'm not should tell you something. It told him she'd changed. That the conspiracy meant to destroy him had also transformed his enemies into people who understood the cost of their choices. Marcus had built his revenge on the assumption that breaking Caedric would bring satisfaction. Instead, it had shown everyone involved that revenge was just another prison. Caedric lowered his blade. "I'll surrender, on the condition that my remaining fighters are granted amnesty. They followed orders. They don't deserve punishment for loyalty." "Agreed," Morgana said immediately. "They'll be incorporated into my forces or released depending on preference. And the trial will be public." "Fair. You'll have opportunity to speak in your own defense, but I won't promise the outcome. I wouldn't believe you if you did." He turned to Seraphine, seeing the fear and relief warring in her expression. "This is what you wanted, right? Me choosing something other than death?" "I wanted you to survive," she said, "but not like this. Not broken." "I've been broken for 20 years, Caedric replied. "This is just the first time I'm admitting it." He handed his blade to Morgana hilt first, the gesture of surrender that ended wars. Around him, the remaining loyalists did the same, their weapons clattering against stone in a sound like finality. The fighting was over. Ravenscar had fallen. Duke Caedric Dravenmore had lost everything. And somehow, standing in that tower surrounded by enemies who'd become something other than enemies, he felt more human than he had in decades. The trial took place 3 weeks later in Ravenscar's restored Great Hall. The same chamber where Kaedric had faced down conspiracies and executed traitors, where he'd married Seraphine beneath storm-dark skies, where he'd built an empire and watched it collapse. Now it served as courtroom for his judgment. The charges were extensive: unlawful executions, excessive taxation, brutality toward subjects, the murder of the Ashcroft children, conspiracy to manipulate the crown. Each accusation was documented with testimony from people who'd suffered under his rule. Kaedric listened to it all without defending himself. What defense existed? He'd done everything they accused him of, committed every crime, made every brutal choice. The only question was whether those choices had been justified by circumstances or whether he'd simply been a tyrant finding excuses for cruelty. When they finally asked for his testimony, he stood and faced the assembled nobles with complete honesty. "Everything you've accused me of is true," he said. "I executed people without trial. I ruled through fear. I made decisions that prioritized maintaining power over protecting the people I was supposed to serve. And I did it all believing I was choosing the lesser evil. That strength required brutality. That mercy was weakness. That the only way to survive was to become something monstrous." The hall was silent, everyone waiting for justification or excuse. "I was wrong," Kaedric continued. "Not about the threats I faced, those were real, but about my response to them. My father tried to rule with compassion and was destroyed for it. I learned the wrong lesson from his death. I decided the problem was compassion rather than the people who exploited it. So I built walls so high nobody could reach me, eliminated threats before they could fully form, and convinced myself that isolation was strength." He looked at Seraphine in the gallery, seeing her watching with an expression he couldn't quite read. "It took losing everything to understand what my father actually knew. Power without humanity isn't power at all. It's just fear wearing a crown, and fear only lasts until someone decides they're not afraid anymore. Marcus wasn't wrong to want revenge. I murdered his family, destroyed his bloodline, gave him every reason to spend 20 years planning my destruction. The tragedy isn't that he betrayed me, it's that I created someone capable of that level of patient hatred." Morgana, presiding over the trial from what had been his throne, leaned forward. "Are you saying you deserve the death penalty? I'm saying I deserve whatever you decide. But I'm also saying that executing me just continues the cycle. My father was destroyed by nobles who felt threatened. I destroyed those nobles and created new enemies. Marcus tried to destroy me and turned half the North into a war zone. At some point, someone has to choose differently. And you believe you're that someone?" "No," Kaedric said. "I believe you are. You won. Completely. You could execute me and nobody would question it. But you're choosing to hold a trial, to establish legitimacy, to build something better than what came before. That takes more courage than anything I ever did." The nobles deliberated for 6 hours. Kaedric spent that time in a cell that was comfortable but secure, staring at walls and contemplating futures that ranged from execution to imprisonment to exile. He'd made peace with all of them. Whatever came next couldn't be worse than the person he'd been before everything collapsed. When they summoned him back to the Great Hall, the verdict was waiting. Morgana read it formally. "Duke Kaedric Dravenmore, this council finds you guilty of crimes against the people of the North. The penalty for these crimes would traditionally be death. However, given your surrender, your testimony, and your acknowledgement of wrongdoing, we're imposing an alternative sentence." He waited, genuinely uncertain what came next. "You're stripped of all titles and lands. House Dravenmore's holdings are forfeit to the crown. You're exiled from the Northern Territories for a period of 20 years. You may not hold political office or military command. You may not own property within the realm's borders. You're permitted to take only what you can carry and whoever chooses to follow you." She paused, letting the weight of the sentence settle. "In 20 years, if you're still alive, you may petition for restoration of citizenship. Not nobility, citizenship. The right to exist in the realm you once ruled. Whether that petition is granted will depend on who you become in exile." The sentence was simultaneously harsher and more merciful than execution. Death would have been simple, final. This was complicated. A lifetime of consequences for choices that had seemed justified at the time. Kaedric bowed. "I accept the council's judgment. You have 3 days to prepare for departure. Use them well. Ma." He spent those 3 days saying goodbye to a life he'd never actually lived. Walking through Ravenscar's corridors, seeing memories in every stone. The training yard where he'd learned to fight. The study where his father had taught him about governance. The chambers where he'd married Seraphine and somehow found connection in a life built on isolation. Most of the servants avoided him. The ones who didn't offered quiet condolences that felt like absolution he hadn't earned. A few brought gifts, small things, mementos from people who remembered moments of kindness buried beneath decades of brutality. A stable boy whose life he'd spared after a theft. A maid he'd protected from a predatory lord. Pieces of humanity he'd forgotten committing, preserved by people who'd seen glimpses of something better than the monster he'd become. On the second day, Aldrich found him in the library. The lieutenant had survived the final battle and accepted incorporation into Morgana's forces. He looked uncomfortable but determined. Your Grace, just Kaedric now. I wanted to say something before you leave. Say it. You were a bastard, ruthless, paranoid, willing to sacrifice anything for power. But you were also the best commander I ever served under. You never asked us to do anything you wouldn't do yourself. Never hid behind rank when the fighting got brutal. And in the end, you chose our lives over victory. That matters. Does it? Kedrick asked. Does choosing right once erase 20 years of choosing wrong? No, but it means you're capable of learning. That's more than most people manage. Aldrich saluted one final time and left. Kedrick stood alone in the library, surrounded by books about governance and philosophy that he'd read but never actually understood. Knowledge without wisdom. Information without insight. The story of his entire existence written in leather and parchment. On the third day, Seraphine came to his chambers. She'd been scarce since the trial, dealing with Elena's recovery and her own processing of everything that had happened. She looked tired but whole, wearing practical travel clothes instead of court finery. I'm coming with you, she said without preamble. No, that's not your decision. Seraphine, you're free. You have your life back. Elena's safe. The council cleared you of all charges. Why would you throw that away to follow an exiled tyrant into whatever wasteland accepts refugees? She moved closer, her expression fierce. Because I didn't fall in love with the Duke of Ravenscar. I fell in love with the man who chose principle over power when it actually mattered, the one who pulled his hand away from that lever even though it meant losing everything. That was one decision. It doesn't erase. I don't care about erasure, she grabbed his hand. I care about who you're becoming, and I want to be part of that journey, even if it means poverty, exile, a life with no guarantee of safety or comfort, especially then. I've lived in comfort. I've navigated court politics. I've been the strategic pawn in games I didn't fully understand. All of it was hollow. The only time I felt genuinely alive was fighting beside you in that keep, watching you choose something harder than survival. Kedrick wanted to argue, wanted to push her away for her own protection, but standing there looking at her fierce determination, he understood that pushing people away for their own good was just another form of control. Seraphine was choosing this. Choosing him, not because she needed protection, but because she wanted partnership. Refusing that choice was disrespecting her autonomy. If you come, he said quietly, there's no going back. The council's mercy doesn't extend to second chances. We leave and we're exiles, permanently. I know. And you're certain? For the first time since I walked into Ravenscar and offered myself as collateral, yes. I'm certain. He pulled her close, feeling the weight of everything they'd survived pressing down like atmosphere. They'd both been broken by this, transformed by choices that couldn't be unmade. But somehow in the wreckage they'd found something worth preserving. Where will we go? She asked. South, beyond the realm's borders. Find somewhere that doesn't care about northern politics. Build something small and quiet. He paused. Live. The word felt foreign. Living rather than surviving. Existing for something beyond power or fear or the endless calculation of threats. Just two people trying to figure out who they could become when everything that had defined them was stripped away. It terrified him more than any battle. They left Ravenscar at dawn on the fourth day. Kedrick wore simple traveler's clothes, carried a pack with supplies, and the few possessions he couldn't abandon. Seraphine walked beside him, equally unburdened by the trappings of nobility. Behind them, Elena had chosen to stay, accepting a position in Morgana's household, building her own future separate from her sister's choices. The road south was crowded with merchants and travelers who didn't recognize the former duke in exile. Anonymity felt strange after decades of being the most feared man in the north. Nobody bowed. Nobody lowered their eyes. People just moved past him like he was ordinary. He was ordinary now. Just another refugee fleeing consequences. Just another person trying to find purpose in a world that didn't care about his former authority. They walked in silence for the first few hours, both processing the finality of what they'd left behind. Ravenscar disappeared behind hills and forests, the fortress becoming memory rather than reality. With each mile, Kydrick felt the weight of his former life lifting incrementally, not erased, that weight would never fully disappear, but becoming bearable. Around midday, they stopped at a river to refill water and rest. Seraphine sat beside him on the bank, both of them watching water flow past with the mindless persistence of nature that didn't care about human drama. "Do you regret it?" she asked, "surrendering instead of fighting to the end?" "Every hour," Kydrick admitted. "Part of me keeps thinking I should have died in that keep. Gone down fighting like every story says rulers should. At least then I'd be remembered as someone who didn't quit. And the other part? Knows that dying would have been easier than this. Living with consequences, facing what I became, trying to figure out who I can be now that everything defining me is gone." She took his hand. "You're not alone in that. I know. That's the only reason I'm not walking into this river and ending it." The honesty was brutal but necessary. Seraphine deserved to know how close to the edge he was, how the guilt and shame and accumulated weight of 2 decades pressed down like physical pressure. Survival required acknowledging the darkness rather than pretending it didn't exist. "You saved those prisoners," she said. "In the dungeons, you chose their lives over tactical advantage. One good choice doesn't balance 20 years of bad ones." "Maybe not. But it's a start." She looked at him directly. "My father used to say that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about choosing differently going forward. One decision at a time, one day at a time. Building something new from the ruins of what you were. Your father also destroyed your family through embezzlement." Seraphine laughed. It was a hard sound, but genuine. True. Which means he understood failure intimately, and maybe that gave him perspective on second chances. They sat in silence, watching the river until the sun angled toward afternoon. Then they stood and continued south, 2 exiles walking toward uncertain futures with nothing but each other and the slim hope that people could actually change. Months passed. They settled in a coastal town far beyond the realm's borders, a place where northern politics meant nothing and former titles were just stories. Kydrick found work as a guard for merchant caravans, his combat skills still valuable even without the authority that had once backed them. Seraphine used her education to teach children of families who could afford tutors. The work was simple, mundane. Nothing like ruling territories or commanding armies. But it was honest in a way Kydrick's previous life had never been. He protected people for agreed wages. She educated children who wanted to learn, no manipulation, no fear, just straightforward exchange of skills for compensation. At night, they shared a small house near the harbor, listening to waves and talking about futures that had nothing to do with vengeance or power. Slowly, incrementally, Kydrick started to remember what it felt like to be human rather than ruler, to care about things beyond survival and control. He still had nightmares, still woke up gasping, reliving executions and betrayals and the faces of people who died because of his orders. The guilt didn't disappear, but he learned to carry it differently, not as justification for further brutality, but as reminder of the cost of his choices. Seraphine had her own demons, moments where she'd freeze at sudden noises or react with defensive aggression to perceived threats. They were both damaged, both carrying trauma that would never fully heal, but they were healing together, which made the burden bearable. One evening, sitting on their small porch watching sunset paint the ocean in shades of fire, Seraphine said, "Do you think we'll ever go back? To the north? I don't know. Maybe in 20 years when the exile ends. Maybe never. Would you want to?" Kydrick considered the question honestly. Part of him still ached for Ravenscar. for the weight of authority and the clarity of purpose that ruling had provided. But that ache was nostalgic rather than genuine, longing for a simplified past that had never actually existed. "No," he said finally. "That person who ruled Ravenscar, he's dead. Whatever I'm becoming now, it's something different. Going back would just be trying to resurrect a corpse. So we stay here? We build here. Small, quiet. Something that doesn't require becoming a monster to maintain." She leaned against him, both of them watching light fade from the sky. In the distance, ships moved across water with purposes that had nothing to do with their story. The world was vast and indifferent, full of people who'd never heard of Duke Dravenmore and didn't care about northern conspiracies. That indifference was liberating. Years passed. The nightmares became less frequent. The guilt remained but transformed into something he could live with, acknowledgement of crimes committed rather than crushing weight that made existence unbearable. He learned to laugh again, found joy in simple things like watching Seraphine teach children or sharing meals with neighbors who knew him as Cade, the caravan guard, rather than Caedric the tyrant. Eventually, news from the north reached them. Morgana had consolidated her rule, established stable governance, reformed the brutal systems Caedric had created. The territories were prospering. People spoke of the new era with hope rather than fear. Everything he'd tried to accomplish through violence and control, she'd achieved through legitimacy and patience. The irony should have been bitter. Instead, it felt validating, proof that his methods had been wrong, that the world he'd believed required brutality actually just required people willing to build something better. On the 10th anniversary of their exile, Seraphine gave birth to a daughter. They named her Elena, after her aunt who'd chosen her own path in the north. Holding the infant in his arms, Caedric understood with complete clarity why his father had been willing to sacrifice everything for connection. This was what mattered, not power or fear or legacy measured in conquered territories. Just this small, fragile life depending on him for protection and guidance. The responsibility terrified him more than any battle, because failing this child meant becoming the same monster he'd spent a decade trying to leave behind. But failure wasn't inevitable. He'd learned that much in exile. People could change. Monsters could choose differently. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but refusing to repeat it. He held his daughter and made silent promises. That she'd never watch him execute someone for questioning his authority. That she'd grow up understanding power as responsibility rather than control. That she'd see her father as a man who'd done terrible things and spent the rest of his life trying to become better. Whether he could keep those promises remained uncertain, but the trying mattered more than guaranteed success. 20 years after leaving Ravenscar, Caedric stood at the border of the northern territories with Seraphine and their daughter. The exile had officially ended. He could petition for restoration of citizenship, could return to lands he'd once ruled, could see what had become of the empire he'd built and lost. Elena was 19 now, curious about the homeland she'd never seen. She'd grown up hearing stories about the North, carefully edited versions that acknowledged her father's failures without dwelling on specifics. She knew he'd been a ruler who'd made terrible choices. She didn't know the full depth of those choices because some truths were too heavy for children. "Are we going in?" she asked, looking at the border marker. Caedric looked at Seraphine, seeing the same uncertainty in her expression. They'd built a good life in exile. Safe, stable. Returning risked everything they'd constructed, but it also offered closure. The chance to face what he'd been. To see whether the person he'd become could exist in proximity to his former life without regressing into old patterns. "Yes," he said, "but just to visit. This isn't home anymore." They crossed the border into territories that looked simultaneously familiar and alien. Towns had grown, roads had improved. The landscape was the same, but the atmosphere was different. People moved without the constant tension that had defined Caedric's rule. Fear had been replaced by something approaching contentment. It took 3 days to reach Ravenscar. The fortress had been fully restored, its black marble walls gleaming in afternoon sun. But the banners flying from the towers were House Castell's rather than House Dravenmore's, a visual reminder that power had transferred, that his legacy was historical rather than current. They were granted audience with Morgana, who'd aged gracefully into authority. She received them in the same great hall where Caedric's trial had taken place, her expression neutral but not hostile. "Caedric Dravenmore," she said. I wondered if you'd return. Duchess Castell. He bowed, acknowledging her authority. I'm here to petition for citizenship restoration, for myself and my family. Morgana studied them. Cadric, Seraphine, young Elena watching everything with wide eyes. The council will need to review your petition formally, but speaking personally, I see no reason to deny it. You've served your sentence. Reports from the Southern Territories suggest you've lived quietly and caused no trouble. As far as I'm concerned, the exile is complete. She paused. But I do have questions. Starting with, why come back at all? You built a life elsewhere. Why risk disrupting it? Closure, Cadric said honestly. I needed to see what became of this place, to understand whether the work you've done here actually succeeded where I failed. And it did. Morgana, you accomplished everything I tried to force through fear. You proved my father was right, and I was wrong. That takes courage I never had. The Duchess's expression softened slightly. You're giving me too much credit. I had advantages you didn't. I wasn't trying to hold power inherited through violence. I could build legitimacy from scratch rather than defending something fundamentally broken. Still, what you've created here is better than anything I managed. Morgana stood and walked to the window overlooking Ravenscar's courtyard. It's different, she corrected. Not necessarily better. You ruled during unstable times, made brutal choices that seemed necessary given the threats you faced. I've had the luxury of building during peace. She turned back to face him. But I'll tell you what I learned from watching your fall and building from the ruins. Power is temporary. Legacy is what you leave behind when power's gone. You left trauma and fear. I'm trying to leave institutions and stability. 20 years from now, someone else will rule here, and they'll judge both of us by what we built rather than what we intended. The words carried weight, not absolution, but acknowledgement that history was complex, that rulers were people making choices under pressure, sometimes succeeding and often failing. What do you want from this petition? Morgana asked. What does restoration mean to you? The right to exist here, Cadric said, to show my daughter where I came from, to visit my father's grave and make peace with his memory. I'm not seeking power or influence, just the ability to be present without exile hanging over me. Morgana considered this. Then your petition is granted, citizenship restored. You're free to travel the Northern Territories without restriction. Welcome home, Cadric. The word hung in the air. Home, a place that had defined him, destroyed him, and ultimately revealed who he actually was beneath the armor of authority. Cadric bowed deeply. Thank you. He visited his father's grave that evening, alone. The old duke was buried in Ravenscar's crypt beneath stones that carried names going back centuries. Cadric stood before the marker, feeling the weight of everything he'd never said. You were right, he said to the stone, about mercy, about connection, about everything I dismissed as weakness. I spent 20 years proving I was stronger than you. Turned out I was just better at being cruel. Took losing everything to understand what you actually knew. The crypt was silent except for his voice echoing off stone. I have a daughter now. Named her after someone who showed more courage than I ever managed. And I'm terrified, Father. Terrified I'll fail her the way I failed you. That I'll teach her the wrong lessons. That she'll grow up believing power matters more than humanity. He sat on the cold floor, back against his father's tomb. But I'm trying. Every day I make choices that honor what you believed rather than what I became. It's hard. The instinct to control, to eliminate threats, to rule through fear, all of it's still there. But I'm learning to choose differently. One decision at a time. One day at a time. A sound made him turn. Seraphine stood in the crypt's entrance with Elena, both of them respectful of the moment, but present. Thought you might want company, Seraphine said. Cadric gestured them closer. They sat beside him in the darkness, 3 generations connected by choices made and consequences survived. Elena looked at her grandfather's tomb. What was he like? Cadric thought about the question, about the man who'd tried to rule with compassion in a brutal world, who'd been destroyed for his mercy but had died believing in something beyond survival. He was better than me, Cadric said simply, but I'm working on becoming worthy of being his son, They sat in the crypt until darkness fell completely, three people connected by blood and choice, acknowledging the past while facing the uncertain future. The weeks that followed were surreal. Kedrick walked through Ravenscar, seeing ghosts in every corridor. The training yard where he'd learned violence, the study where he'd planned campaigns, the dungeons where he'd ordered executions that had seemed justified at the time, but now just felt like accumulated murders. People recognized him occasionally. Former subjects who remembered the Duke and weren't sure how to react to his return. Most avoided him. A few approached with stories, some bitter about his rule, others surprisingly grateful for moments of fairness buried in decades of brutality. He listened to all of it, accepted the anger and the gratitude with equal acknowledgement. This was his legacy, complicated, contradictory, neither purely monstrous nor secretly heroic, just a ruler who'd made choices under pressure and lived to see their consequences. One afternoon, walking through Ravenscar's market, he encountered someone unexpected. A young man, maybe 25, who stopped him with careful intensity. "You're Kedrick Dravenmore." "I am." The young man studied him. "My father was one of Marcus's brothers, one of the people working to destroy you. He died in the keep during the final assault." Kedrick felt his chest tighten. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Are you?" The young man's voice was neutral, not hostile, but not friendly. "My father dedicated his life to revenge for crimes you committed, died pursuing it, and now you're just walking through markets like some retired merchant?" "What would you have me do?" Kedrick asked honestly. "I don't know." The young man's composure cracked slightly. "I thought I'd feel something seeing you. Anger, hatred, the need for my own revenge. But you just look tired, old, human. I am human. That's the tragedy. If I'd been a monster, it would be simpler. But I was just a person making terrible choices and believing they were necessary." They stood in the market while people flowed around them, two people connected by violence trying to figure out what healing looked like. "Did you love him?" Kedrick asked. "Your father?" "I barely knew him. He was always planning, always focused on conspiracy. The revenge defined him more than family ever did. Then don't let it define you. Learn from his mistakes and mine. Build something better than endless cycles of retribution." The young man was silent for a long moment. Then, "That's easy for you to say. You gotta walk away. Start over. My father died still consumed by hatred." "You're right. It's easy for me to preach lessons learned too late." Kedrick met his eyes. "But the alternative is spending your life the way your father did, consumed by past grievances, missing the present, becoming hollow. I did that for 20 years and it destroyed everything I touched. Don't make the same mistake." The young man nodded slowly and walked away without another word. Kedrick watched him go, hoping the seed he'd planted might grow into something other than more violence. But hope was all he had. He couldn't control what others chose, couldn't force healing or forgiveness, could only offer the hard-won wisdom of someone who'd learned too late what actually mattered. As their visit to the north extended into months, Kedrick found himself being pulled into unexpected roles. Morgana asked him to speak to new officers about the dangers of ruling through fear. Younger nobles sought his perspective on governance. Former subjects approached with questions about their own struggles with power and consequence. Slowly, incrementally, he became something he'd never imagined. An educator. Someone whose failures taught lessons more valuable than any success could have provided. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 20 years trying to build a legacy through power. Instead, his legacy was becoming the cautionary tale that helped others avoid his mistakes. One evening, giving a talk to Morgana's council about the collapse of his rule, he found himself being brutally honest. "I believe strength meant never showing weakness, that mercy was fatal, that the only way to survive was to make everyone fear you more than they feared anything else. And I was wrong about all of it." He looked at the assembled nobles, young, ambitious, carrying the same hunger for power he'd once possessed. Fear works in the short term. It keeps people obedient, eliminates visible threats, creates the illusion of control. But it's inherently unstable because eventually someone stops being afraid, or someone becomes more feared than you, or you become so isolated that betrayal comes from inside your own walls. "What's the alternative?" one of the nobles asked. If not fear, then what? Legitimacy, Kadric said. The kind Duchess Castell has built here, where people follow because they believe in the system rather than fearing the ruler. It's harder, slower, requires actual competence rather than just brutality, but it's sustainable in ways fear never is. He paused. I spent 20 years being the most feared man in the North, and it got me exiled and broken. Morgana spent 20 years building institutions and trust, and she's created something that will outlast her. Learn from my failure. Build for the long term. Be the kind of leader people choose to follow rather than one they're forced to obey. The talk ended with thoughtful silence rather than applause. These nobles were processing uncomfortable truths about power and its limits. Exactly what Caedric had needed to hear decades ago, but had been too arrogant to accept. After the session, Morgana approached him privately. You're good at this. Teaching. Have you considered staying, making it permanent? The offer surprised him. Stay in the North? Return to Ravenscar in a capacity that wasn't ruling? I have a life elsewhere, he said. A home. Work that's simple but meaningful. I know. But you also have knowledge that could prevent the next generation from repeating your mistakes. That has value. Caedric thought about it. About choosing to remain close to his former life versus returning to the quiet existence he'd built in exile. Both had merits. Both had risks. Let me discuss it with Seraphine, he said. That evening, sitting with his wife and daughter overlooking Ravenscar's harbor, he presented Morgana's offer. What do you want to do? Seraphine asked. I don't know. Part of me wants to stay, to use my failures to help others. But part of me worries that staying means never truly moving forward, that I'll become trapped in my own past. Elena spoke up, her young voice carrying surprising wisdom. Father, you're always going to carry your past. Geography doesn't change that. The question is whether you're running from it or choosing to face it. Caedric looked at his daughter, seeing the person she was becoming. Strong, thoughtful, unafraid of hard truths. When did you get so smart? She smiled. I had good teachers. Both of you showed me that mistakes don't define you. How you respond to them does. He turned to Seraphine. What do you think? I think we've spent 20 years building a life defined by what you're running from. Maybe it's time to build one defined by what you're moving toward. The wisdom in her words settled something in his chest. She was right. Exile had been about escape, about creating distance from crimes and consequences. But true healing required facing those things rather than hiding from them. We stay, he said. Not forever, but long enough to do the work Morgana's asking for, to help prevent the next tyrant from making my mistakes. Seraphine took his hand. Then we stay. The years that followed were unlike anything Caedric had imagined. He became a fixture at Ravenscar, not as ruler, but as teacher and advisor. He spoke to young nobles about the psychology of power, helped Morgana identify and dismantle systems that enabled tyranny, worked with former enemies to build frameworks that prevented the concentration of authority he'd once wielded. It was hard work. Every day forced him to confront his failures publicly, to acknowledge crimes he'd rather forget, to watch people react with disgust or pity, or occasionally forgiveness to stories about what he'd done. But it was also healing work. Each admission of wrongdoing was a small step toward becoming someone who'd actually learned from his mistakes. Each young noble who chose differently because of his warnings was a tiny redemption for all the people he'd failed to protect. Seraphine taught alongside him, her perspective on surviving tyranny complementing his understanding of perpetrating it. Together they created educational programs about power and its dangers, training the next generation to recognize warning signs in themselves and their leaders. Elena grew into a remarkable young woman, eventually joining Morgana's council as an advocate for reform. Watching her work with confidence and compassion, Caedric understood that his greatest legacy wasn't anything he'd built through power. It was this person, raised by parents who'd survived their worst selves and committed to becoming better. On the 30th anniversary of his exile's beginning, Caedric stood on Ravenscar's battlements, watching sunrise paint the northern territories in shades of gold. The fortress looked the same as it had decades ago, but felt completely different. No longer a monument to fear, but a center of governance that actually served its people. Seraphine joined him, her hair gray now, her face lined with years, but still carrying the fierce determination he'd first seen in his drawing room. "Regrets?" she asked. "Thousands," he replied, "but also gratitude. For this, for you, for getting the chance to become something other than the monster I was. You were never just a monster. Close enough. But you helped me find the parts that weren't, the parts worth preserving." They stood together as the sun climbed higher, two people who'd survived impossible situations and chosen to build something meaningful from the wreckage. Below them, Ravenscar woke to another day. The fortress that had witnessed so much violence and pain now served as symbol of transformation, of the possibility that people could change, that cycles could be broken, that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but refusing to repeat it. Cedric thought about the journey that had brought him here, the brutal choices, the devastating consequences, the slow, painful work of becoming someone different. None of it had been inevitable. Every step had been a choice. And the hardest choice had been admitting he'd been wrong. But that admission had freed him, opened possibilities he'd never imagined when he was building empires on fear. He'd been Duke Cedric Dravenmore, the Iron Duke, the tyrant of the North. He'd ruled through brutality and lost everything. Now he was just Cedric, a teacher, a father, a man trying to help others avoid his mistakes. It wasn't the legacy he'd imagined, but it was the one he'd earned. And standing on those battlements with Seraphine beside him, watching the territories he'd once dominated now thriving under better governance, Cedric understood that earning it had been worth every painful step. The sun continued rising, indifferent to human drama, illuminating a world that had survived his worst and learned to build something better. He'd been afraid of becoming his father, of showing weakness, of being destroyed by mercy. Instead, he'd become something worse and then something better. A monster who'd learned to be human again. A tyrant who'd found redemption not through grand gestures but through quiet, daily choices to do better. The journey wasn't over. Might never be over. But for the first time in his life, Cedric was at peace with that uncertainty. Because power and control had never been the point. Connection was the point. Purpose was the point. Building something worth protecting rather than something built on fear. He'd learned that lesson too late to save his first empire, but early enough to build a second life worth living. And that, in the end, was enough.